We are here today for the very first stream, as it were, of the Threefold Manifold, here with myself, Kairos. And in that, allow me to, for those of you who watched the introduction video, and perhaps for those who haven't, and this will be the very first time you'll be seeing me, show who I am properly. Hello, everybody. As I say, this is the very first stream, not just on this particular channel, but that I have ever attempted. And with that, while I have done some good work on this, there are, of course, little minutiae that I will be coming to grips with here today. But, nonetheless, we are here together to understand at least the very first portions of what it means, per the title, that peace demands power, as we review and read Sun Tzu's Art of War. The first of many parts is, of course, for those of you who have any foreknowledge of it, it is a particularly rich piece, even if it is not the longest tome in the world. And today, we will in fact be reading a good deal of specifically the translation by Lionel Giles. In that, this is thankfully provided public domain by the Gutenberg Project, and we will begin on the page of attribution and recognition unto them. Throughout this, we will then be taking pauses, I would say approximately every 30 minutes or so, if there is any particular curiosity to be had, as I'll be keeping an eye on the chat for analysis, review, discussion, terminology. Of course, it is what some consider an introductory tome, but being that it is one of the, as they say, world's oldest treaties on war and strategy overall, there may be things that require some clarification that I might be able to help with. So, without further ado, let us away over to our baseline, where we can see all of the lovely messages that you guys have sent, and I have responded with, and we will begin by taking a look at just that document, as it were. This will be behind us, and if we need a particular look at it for the specific verbiage or any finer details within the text itself, we can easily remove the overlay, and I'll abide by the requests per the chat. But let us then dig in. So we will have our cam from there to here, and our chat from here to there, where I'll be able to see all of the lovely words as they... Let us then dig in, shall we? So, getting into the meat of Sun Tzu's Art of War. And like I said earlier, the oldest military treatise in the world, with critical notes by the Lionel Giles himself. We come through the contents and into the preface. Now, I will, in fact, turn the pages rather slowly for those of you who would wish to pause and read through these, and then we will move on swiftly into the meat of the thing. And once we do that, the music will be paused so that we can have the most clear listen of the actual text itself. And so here we are. Sun Wu and his book. And do forgive me, I am a native English speaker and not a Chinese fluent individual. So if there are any corrections to pronunciations, I will be keeping an eye on the side chat if you wish to suggest them. But here we go. Sima Qian gives the following biography of Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu Wu was a native of the Qi state. His art of war brought him to the notice of Ho Lu, king of Wu. Ho Lu said to him, "I have carefully perused your 13 chapters. May I submit your theory of managing soldiers to a slight test?" Sun Tzu replied, "You may." Ho Lu asked, "May the test be applied to women?" The answer was again in the affirmative, so arrangements were made to bring 180 ladies out of the palace. Sun Tzu divided them into 2 companies and placed one of the king's favorite concubines at the head of each. He then bade them take spears, in their hands and address them thus: "I presume you know the difference between front and back, right hand and left hand." The girls replied, "Yes." Sun Tzu went on, "When I say eyes front, you must look straight ahead. When I say left turn, you must face towards your left hand. When I say right turn, you must face towards your right hand. When I say about turn, you must face right round towards the back." Again the girls assented. The words of command having been thus explained, he set up the halberds and battle axes in order to begin the drill. Then, to the sound of drums, he gave the order, "Right turn." But the girls only burst out laughing. Sun Tzu said, "If words of command are not clear and distinct, if orders are not thoroughly understood, then the general is to blame." So he started drilling them again, and this time gave the order, "Left turn," whereupon the girls once more burst into fits of laughter. Sun Tzu said, "If words of command are not clear and distinct, if orders are not thoroughly understood, the general is to blame. But if his orders are clear, and the soldiers nevertheless disobey, then it is the fault of the officers." So saying, he ordered the leaders of the 2 companies to be beheaded. Now the king of Wu was watching the scene from the top of a raised pavilion, and when he saw that his favorite concubines were about to be executed, he was greatly alarmed and hurriedly sent down the following message: "We are now quite satisfied as to our general's ability to handle troops. If we are bereft of these 2 concubines, our meat and drink will lose their savor. It is our wish that they shall not be beheaded." Sun Tzu replied, "Having once received His Majesty's commission to be general of his forces, there are certain commands of His Majesty which, acting in that capacity, I am unable to accept." Accordingly, he had the 2 leaders beheaded, and straightway installed the pair next in order as leaders in their place. When this had been done, the drum was sounded for the drill once more, and the girls went through all the evolutions, turning to the left or to the right or to the left, marching ahead or wheeling back, kneeling or standing, with perfect accuracy and precision, not venturing to utter a sound. Then Sun Tzu sent a messenger to the king saying, "Your soldiers, sire, are now properly drilled and disciplined, and ready for your Majesty's inspection. They can be put to any use that their sovereign may desire. Bid them go through fire and water, and they will not disobey." But the king replied, "Let our general cease drilling and return to camp. And as for us, we have no wish to come down and inspect the troops." Thereupon Sun Tzu said, "The king is only fond of words, and cannot translate them into deeds." After that, Ho Lu saw that Sun Tzu was one who knew how to handle an army, and finally appointed him general. In the west, he defeated the Chu state, and forced his way into Ying, the capital, to the north. He put fear into the states of Qi and Qin, and spread his fame abroad amongst the feudal princes, and Sun Tzu shared in the might of the king. About Sun Tzu himself. This is all that Sima Qian has to tell us in this chapter, but he proceeds to give a biography of his descendant, Sun Pin, born about 100 years after his famous ancestor's death, and also the outstanding military genius of his time. The historian of him, too, as Sun Tzu, and in his preface we read, Sun Tzu had his feet cut off and yet continued to discuss the art of war. It seems likely, then, that Pin was a nickname bestowed on him after his mutilation, unless indeed the story was invented in order to account for his name. Correction, the name. The crowning incident of his career, the crushing defeat of his treachery rival, Pang Chuan, will be found briefly related on page 40. To return to the elder Sun Tzu, he is mentioned in 2 other passages of the Shiqi. In the 3rd year of his reign, 512 BC, Ho Lu, king of Wu, took the field with Su Su, i.e. Wu Yuan, and Po Pei, and attacked Shu. He captured the town of Shu, and slew the 2 princes' sons who had formerly been generals of Wu. He was then meditating a descent on Ying, the capital. But the general Su Wu said, "The army is exhausted. It is not yet possible. We must wait." After further successful fighting, in the 9th year, 506 BC, King Ho Lu of Wu addressed Wu Tzu and Sun Wu, saying, "Formerly, you declared that it was not yet possible for us to enter Ying. Is the time ripe now?" The 2 men replied, "Chu's general, Su Qiang, is grasping and covetous, and the princes of Tang and Tsai both have a grudge against him. If your majesty has resolved to make a grand attack, you must win over Tang and Tsai, and then you may succeed." Ho Lu followed this advice, beat Chu in 5 pitched battles, and marched into Ying. This is the latest date at which anything is recorded of Sun Wu. He does not appear to have survived his patron, who died from the effects of a wound in 496. In the chapter entitled, the earlier portion of which M. Shavanas believes to be a fragment of a treatise on military weapons, there occurs this passage. From this time onward, a number of famous soldiers arose, one after the other. Cao Fan, who was employed by the Qin state, Wang Tzu, in the service of Qi, and Sun Wu in the service of Wu. These men developed and threw light upon the principles of war. It is obvious that Sima Qian at least had no doubt about the reality of Sun Wu as a historical personage, and with one exception to be noticed presently, he is by far the most important authority on the period in question. It will not be necessary, therefore, to say much of a work as the Wu Yue Chun Qiu, which is supposed to have been written by Chao Wei of the 1st century AD. The attribution is somewhat doubtful, but even if it were otherwise, his account would be of little value, based, as it is, on the Shiqi and expanded with romantic details. The story of Sun Tzu will be found for what it is worth in Chapter 2. The only new points in it worth noting are 1. Sun Tzu was first recommended to Ho Lu by Wu Tzu. He is called a native of Wu. Number 2. 3. He had previously lived a retired life, and his contemporaries were unaware of his ability. The following passage occurs in Huainan Tzu. When sovereign and ministers show perversity of mind, it is impossible even for a Sun Tzu to encounter the foe. Assuming that this work is genuine, and hitherto no doubt has been cast upon it, We have here the earliest direct reference to Sun Tzu, for Huainanzi died in 122 BC, many years before the Shi Qi was given to the world. Liu Xiang, BC 80 through 9, in his work says the reason why Sun Wu, at the head of 30,000 men, beat Chu with 200,000 is that the latter were undisciplined. Tang Mishi, in his work, completed in 1134, informs us that the surname, as it were, was bestowed on Sun Wu's grandfather by Duke Qing of Qi, 547 through 490 BC. Sun Wu's father, Sun Ping, rose to be a minister of state in Qi, and Sun Wu himself, whose style was Chongqing, fled to Wu on account of the rebellion, which was being fomented by the kindred of Tianpao. He had 3 sons, of whom the second, named Ming, was the father of Sun Pin. According to this account, then, Pin was the grandson of Wu, which, considering that Sun Pin's victory over Wei was gained in 341 BC, may be dismissed as chronologically impossible. Whence these dates were obtained by Teng Mishi, I do not know, but of course no reliance whatever can be placed in them. An interesting document which has survived from the close of the Han period is the short preface written by the great Cao Cao, or Wei Wuti, for his edition of Sun Tzu. I shall give it in full. I have heard that the ancients used bows and arrows to their advantage. The Lun Yu says there must be a sufficiency of military strength. The Shu Qing mentions the army among the 8 objects of government. The first Qing says, army indicates firmness and justice. The experienced leader will have good fortune. The Shi Qing says, the king rose majestic in his wrath, and he marshaled his troops. The Yellow Emperor Tang, the completer, and Wu Weng all used spears and battle axes in order to succor their generation. The Suma Fa says, if one man slay another of set purpose, he himself may rightfully be slain. He who relies solely on warlike measures shall be exterminated. He who relies solely on peaceful measures shall perish. Instances of this are Fu Chai on the one hand and Yin Weng on the other. In military matters, the sage's rule is normally to keep the peace, and to move his forces only when occasion requires. He will not use armed force unless driven to it by necessity. Many books have I read on the subject of war and fighting, but the work composed by Sun Wu is the profoundest of them all. Sun Tzu was a native of the Qi state. His personal name was Wu. He wrote The Art of War in 13 chapters for Ho Lu, king of Wu. Its principles were tested on women, and he was subsequently made a general. He led an army westwards, crushed the Chu state, and entered Ying the capital. In the north he kept Qi and Qin in awe. 100 years and more after his time, Sun Pin lived. He was a descendant of Wu. In his treatment of deliberation and planning, the importance of rapidity in taking the field, clearness of conception, and depth of design, Sun Tzu stands beyond the reach of carping criticism. My contemporaries, however, have failed to grasp the full meaning of his instructions, and while putting into practice the smaller details, in which his work abounds, they have overlooked its essential purport. That is the motive which has led me to outline a rough explanation of the whole. One thing to be noticed in the above is the explicit statement that the 13 chapters were specially composed for King Ho Lu. This is supported by the internal evidence of 15, in which it seems clear that some ruler is addressed. In the bibliographical section of the Han Shu, there is an entry which has given rise to much discussion. The works of Sun Tzu of Wu in 82 pian, or chapters, with diagrams and 9 Qian. It is evident that this cannot be merely the 13 chapters known to Sima Qian, or those we possess today. Zhang Xiaojie, in his work, refers to an edition of Sun Tzu's work, of which the 13 chapters formed the first Qian, adding that there were 2 other Qian besides. This has brought forth a theory that the bulk of these 82 chapters consisted of other writings of Sun Tzu, we should call them apocryphal, similar to the Winta, of which a specimen dealing with the 9 situations is preserved in the Tongtian, and another in Hoshi's commentary. It is suggested that before his interview with Holu, Sun Tzu had only written the 13 chapters, but afterwards composed a sort of exegesis in the form of question and answer between himself and the king. P.E. Sun, author of the Sun Tzu Su Lu, backs this up with a quotation from the Wu Wei Chunqiu. The king of Wu summoned Sun Tzu and asked him questions about the art of war. Each time he set forth a chapter of his work, the king could not find words enough to praise him. As he points out, if the whole work was expounded on the same scale as in the above-mentioned fragments, the total number of chapters could not fail to be considerable. Then the numerous other treatises attributed to Sun Tzu might also be included. The fact that the Han Qi mentions no work of Sun Tzu except the 82 Pian, whereas the Sui and Teng bibliographies give the titles of others in addition to the 13 chapters, is good proof P.E. Sun thinks that all of these were contained in the 82 Pian. Without pinning our faith to the accuracy of detail supplied by the Wu Yue Chun Chiu, or admitting the genuineness of any of the treatises cited by Pai-E Sun, we may see in this theory a probable solution to the mystery. Between Suma Qian and Panku, there was plenty of time for a luxuriant crop of forgeries to have grown up under the magic name of Sun Tzu. And the 82 Pian may very well represent a collected edition of these lumped together with the original work. It is also possible, though less likely, that some of them existed in the time of the earlier historians and were purposely ignored by him. Tu Mu, after Cao Kung, the most important commentator on Sun Tzu, composed the preface to this edition about the middle of the 9th century. After a somewhat lengthy defense of the military art, he comes at last to Sun Tzu himself, and makes 1 or 2 very startling assertions. The writing of Sun Wu, he says, originally comprised several 100,000 words, but Cao Cao, the Emperor Wu Wei, pruned away all redundancies and wrote out the essence of the whole, so as to form a single book in 13 chapters. He goes on to remark that Cao Cao's commentary on Sun Tzu leaves a certain proportion of difficulties unexplained. This, in Tu Mu's opinion, does not necessarily imply that he was unable to furnish a complete commentary. According to the Wei Qi, Cao himself wrote a book on war in something over 100,000 words, known as a particular work. It appears to have been of such exceptional merit that he suspects Cao to have used for it the surplus material which he had found in Sun Tzu. He concludes, however, by saying, the Sin Shu is now lost so that the truth cannot be known for certain. Tu Mu's conjecture seems to be based on a passage in the Wei Wu Ti strung together with Sun Wu's Art of War, which in turn may have resulted from a misunderstanding of the final words of Cao Kung's preface. This, as Sun Hsing-yin points out, is only a modest way of saying that he made an explanatory paraphrase, or in other words, wrote a commentary on it. On the whole, the theory has met with very little acceptance. Thus, the given work says, the mention of the 13 chapters in the Shiqi shows that they were in existence before the Hanqi, and that later accretions are not to be considered part of the original work. Tumu's assertion can certainly not be taken as proof. There is every reason to suppose, then, that the 13 chapters existed in the time of Sumachian practically as we have them now, that the work was then well known. He tells us in so many words. Sun Tzu's 13 chapters and Wu Qi's Art of War are the two books that people commonly refer to on the subject of military matters. Both of them are widely distributed, so I will not discuss them here. But as we go further back, serious difficulties begin to arise. The salient fact, which has to be faced, is that the Cao Chuan, the great contemporary record, makes no mention whatever of Sun Wu, either as a general or as a writer. It is natural, in view of this awkward circumstance, that many scholars should not only cast doubt on the story of Sun Wu as given in the Shiqi, but even show themselves frankly skeptical as to the existence of the man at all. The most powerful presentment of this side of the case is to be found in the following disquisition by Ye Shui-sen. It is stated in Sumachian's history that Sun Wu was a native of the Qi state and employed by Wu, and that in the reign of Ho Lu, he crushed Chu, entered Yang, and was a great general. But in So's commentary, no Sun Wu appears at all. It is true that So's commentary need not contain absolutely everything that other histories contain, but So has not omitted to mention vulgar plebeians and hireling ruffians such as Ying Kaoshu, Cao Kui, Chu Chi Wu, and Chuan Shechu. In the case of Sun Wu, whose fame and achievements were so brilliant, the omission is much more glaring. Again, details are given, in their due order, about his contemporaries, Wu Yuan and the minister Pie. Is it credible that Sun Wu alone should have been passed over? In point of literary style, Sun Tzu's work belongs to the same school as Quanzu, the Liu Tao, and the UAU, and may have been the production of some private scholar living towards the end of the spring and autumn, or the beginning of the Warring States period. The story that his precepts were actually applied by the Wu state is merely the outcome of big talk on the part of his followers. From the flourishing period of the Chao dynasty, down to the time of the spring and autumn, all military commanders were statesmen as well, and the class of professional generals for conducting external campaigns did not then exist. It was not until the period of the Six States that this custom changed. Now, although Wu was an uncivilized state, it is conceivable that So should have left unrecorded the fact that Sun Wu was a great general and yet held no civil office. What we are told, therefore, about Zheng Chu and Sun Wu is not authentic matter, but the reckless fabrication of theorizing pundits. The story of Ho Lu's experiment on the women in particular is utterly preposterous and incredible. Ye Shui-sen represents Suma Qian as having said that Sun Wu crushed Chu and entered Ying. This is not quite correct. No doubt the impression left on the reader's mind is that he at least shared in these exploits, but the actual subject of the verbs, as they were, is certainly a different matter, as is shown by the next words, as they were. The fact may or may not be significant, but it is nowhere explicitly stated in the Shiqi either that Sun Tzu was general on the occasion of the taking of Ying, or that he even went there at all. Moreover, as we know that Wu Yuan and Po Pei both took part in the expedition, and also that its success was largely due to the dash and enterprise of the Fu Kai, Ho Lu's younger brother, it is not easy to see how yet another general could have played a very prominent part in the same campaign. Chin-Sun of the Sung dynasty has the note. Military writers look upon Sun Wu as the father of their art, but the fact that he does not appear in the Sochuan, although he is said to have served under Ho Lu, king of Wu, makes it uncertain what period he really belonged to. He also says, the works of Sun Wu and Wu Qi may be of genuine antiquity. It is noticeable that both Ye Shuisin and Chin-Sun, while rejecting the personality of Sun Wu, as he figures in Sima Qian's history, are inclined to accept the date traditionally assigned to the work, which passes under his name. The author of the Sulu fails to appreciate this distinction, and consequently his bitter attack on Chin-Sun really misses its mark. He makes one or two points, however, which certainly tell in favor of the high antiquity of our 13 chapters. Sun Tzu, he says, must have lived in the age of Qing Wang, 519 through 476, because he is frequently plagiarized in subsequent works of the Zhao, Qin, and Han dynasties. The two most shameless offenders in this respect are Wu Qi and Huainan Zhu, both of them important historical personages in their day. The former lived only a century after the alleged date of Sun Tzu, and his death is known to have taken place in 381 BC. It was to him, according to Liu Hsiang, that Seng Qin delivered the Sochuan, which had been entrusted to him by its author. Now, the fact that quotations of the art of war, acknowledged or otherwise, are to be found in so many authors of different epochs establishes a very strong probability that there was some common source anterior to them all, and, in other words, that Sun Tzu's treatise was already in existence towards the end of the 5th century BC. Further proof of Sun Tzu's antiquity is furnished by the archaic or wholly obsolete meanings attached to a number of the words he uses. A list of these, which might perhaps be extended, is given in the Sulu, and though some of the interpretations are doubtful, the main argument is hardly affected thereby. Again, it must not be forgotten that Ye Shuisin, a scholar and critic of the first rank, deliberately pronounces the style of the 13 chapters to belong to the early part of the 5th century. Seeing that he is actually engaged in an attempt to disprove the existence of Sun Wu himself, we may be sure that he would not have hesitated to assign the work to a later date had he not honestly believed the contrary. And it is precisely on such a point that the judgment of an educated Chinaman will carry most weight. Other internal evidence is not far to seek. Thus, in the 13th chapter, portion 1, there is an unmistakable allusion to the ancient system of land tenure, which had already passed away by the time of Mencius, who was anxious to see it revived in a modified form. The only warfare Sun Tzu knows is that carried on between the various feudal princes, as they were, in which armored chariots play a large part. Their use seems to have entirely died out before the end of the Zhao dynasty. He speaks as a man of Wu, a state which ceased to exist as early as 473 BC. On this I shall touch presently. But once refer to the work of the 5th century or earlier, and the chances of its being other than a bona fide production are sensibly diminished. The great age of forgeries did not come until long after. That it should have been forged in the period immediately following 473 is particularly unlikely, for no one as a rule hastens to identify himself with a lost cause. As for Ye Shuisin's theory, that the author was a literary recluse, that seems to me quite untenable. If one thing is more apparent than another after reading the maxims of Sun Tzu, it is that their essence has been distilled from a large store of personal observation and experience. They reflect the mind not only of a born strategist, gifted with a rare faculty of generalization, but also of a practical soldier closely acquainted with the military conditions of his time. To say nothing of the fact that these sayings have been accepted and endorsed by all the greatest captains of Chinese history, they offer a combination of freshness and sincerity, acuteness and common sense, which quite excludes the idea that they were artificially concocted in the study. If we admit, then, that the 13 chapters were the genuine production of a military man living towards the end of the Chun Chu period, are we not bound, in spite of the silence of the Sochuan, to accept Sima Qian's account in its entirety? In view of his high repute as a sober historian, must we not hesitate to assume that the records he drew upon for Sun Wu's biography were false and untrustworthy? The answer, I fear, must be in the negative. There is still one grave, if not fatal, objection to the chronology involved in the story as told in the Shiqi, which, so far as I am aware, nobody has yet pointed out. There are two passages in Sun Tzu in which he alludes to contemporary affairs. The first is in the 6th chapter of the 21st portion. Though according to my estimate, the soldiers of Yue exceed our own in number, that shall advantage them nothing in the matter of victory. I say then that victory can be achieved. The other, in the 11th chapter, portion 30, asked if an army can be made to imitate the Shuai-Jan. I should answer, yes. For the men of Wu and the men of Yue are enemies. Yet if they are crossing a river in the same boat and are caught by a storm, they will come to each other's assistance, just as the left hand helps the right. These two paragraphs are extremely valuable as evidence of the date of composition. They assign the work to the period of the struggle between Wu and Yue. So much has been observed by Pi A Sun. But what has hitherto escaped notice is that they also seriously impair the credibility of Sima Qian's narrative. As we have seen above, the first positive date given in connection with Sun Wu is 512 BC. He is then spoken of as a general acting as confidential advisor to Ho Lu, so that his alleged introduction to that monarch had already taken place. And of course, the 13 chapters must have been written earlier still. But at the time, and for several years after, down to the capture of Ying in 506, Chu, and not Yue, was the great hereditary enemy of Wu. The two states, Chu and Wu, had been constantly at war for over half a century, whereas the first war between Wu and Yue was waged only in 510, and even then was no more than a short interlude sandwiched in the midst of the fierce struggle with Chu. Now Chu is not mentioned in the 13 chapters at all. The natural inference is that they were written at a time when Yue had become the prime antagonist of Wu. That is, after Chu had suffered the great humiliation of 506. At this point, a table of dates may be found useful. BC 514. Accession of Ho Lu. 512. Ho Lu attacks Chu, but is dissuaded from entering Ying, the capital. Shiqi mentions Sun Wu as general. 511. Another attack on Chu. 510. Wu makes a successful attack on Yue. This is the first war between the two states. 509 or 508. Chu invades Wu, but is This is actually a misprint. Chu invades Wu, but is singly defeated at Wucheng. 506. Holu attacks Chu with the aid of Tang and Sai. Decisive battle of Po Chu and capture of Ying. Last mention of Sun Wu in Shichi. 505. Yue makes a raid on Wu in the absence of its army. Wu is beaten by Qin and evacuates Ying. 504. Holu sends Fu Chai to attack Chu. 497. Cao Qian becomes king of Yue. 496. Wu attacks Yue, but is defeated by Cao Qian at Xiu Li. Holu is killed. 494. Fu Chai defeats Cao Qian in the Great Battle of Fu Chiao and enters the capital of Yue. 485 or 484. Cao Qian renders homage to Wu. Death of Wu Tsu. 482. Cao Qian invades Wu in the absence of Fu Chai. 478 to 476. Further attacks by Yue on Wu. 475. Cao Qian lays siege to the capital of Wu. 473. Final defeat and extension of Wu. Final defeat and extinction of Wu. The sentence quoted above in Chapter 7, Part 21, hardly strikes me as one that could have been written in the full flush of victory. It seems rather to imply that, for the moment at least, the tide had turned against Wu, and that she was getting the worst of the struggle. Hence we may conclude that our treatise was not in existence in 505, before which date Yue does not appear to have scored any notable success against Wu. Holu died in 496, so that if the book was written for him, it must have been during the period of 505 through 496, when there was a lull in the hostilities, Wu having presumably been exhausted by its supreme effort against Chu. On the other hand, if we choose to disregard the tradition connecting Sun Wu's name with Holu, it might equally well have seen the light period. It might well have seen the light between 496 and 494, or possibly in the period 482 through 473, when Yue was once again becoming a very serious menace. We may feel fairly certain that the author, whoever he may have been, was not a man of any great eminence in his own day. On this point, the negative testimony of the Tso-Chuan far outweighs any shred of authority still attaching to the Qi, if once its other facts are discredited. Sun Xingyin, however, makes a feeble attempt to explain the omission of his name from the great commentary. It was Wu Sushu, he says, who got all the credit of Sun Wu's exploits, because the latter, being an alien, was not rewarded with an office in the state. How then did Sun Tzu's legend originate? How then did the Sun Tzu legend originate? It may be that the growing celebrity of the book imparted by degrees a kind of factitious renown to its author. It was felt to be only right and proper that one so well versed in the science of war should have solid achievements to his credit as well. Now, the capture of Ying was undoubtedly the greatest feat of arms in Holu's reign. It made a deep and lasting impression on all the surrounding states, and raised Wu to the short-lived zenith of her power. Hence, what more natural, as time went on, than the acknowledged mastery on... Hence, what more natural, as time went on, than the acknowledged mastery of strategy, Sun Wu, should be popularly identified with that campaign. At first perhaps only in the sense that his brain conceived and planned it, afterwards that it was actually carried out by him in conjunction with Wu Yuan, Popei, and Fukai. it is obvious that any attempt to reconstruct even the outline of Sun Tzu's life must be based almost wholly on conjecture. With this necessary proviso, I should say that he probably entered the service of Wu about the time of Ho Lu's accession and gathered experience, though only in the capacity of a subordinate officer, during the intense military activity which marked the first half of that prince's reign. If he rose to be a general at all, he certainly was never on an equal footing with the three above mentioned. He was doubtless present at the investment and occupation of Ying, and witnessed Wu's sudden collapse in the following year. Yue's attack, at this critical juncture, when her rival was embarrassed on every side, seems to have convinced him that this upstart kingdom was the great enemy against whom every effort would henceforth have to be directed. Sun Wu was thus a well-seasoned warrior when he sat down to write his famous book, which according to my reckoning must have appeared towards the end, rather than the beginning, of Ho Lu's reign. The story of the woman may possibly have grown out of some real incident occurring about the same time. As we hear no more of Sun Wu after this from any source, he is hardly likely to have survived his patron or to have taken part in the death struggle with Yue, which began with the disaster at Suili. If these inferences are approximately correct, there is a certain irony in the fate which decreed that China's most illustrious man of peace should be contemporary with her greatest writer on war. Alright, and now that we have gotten through that section, it is time for some discussion, if there is to be any had. We will take a couple of minutes to quickly pan over to the chat. And given that this is, of course, my very first stream, I don't necessarily suspect that there will be a boatload of commentary to be regarded. But certainly in this period, I will have a little sip. Because we've been reading for a little over that 30-minute span that I was suspecting. In my own commentary, I will certainly say that there is much to be regarded from this section. I think rather self-evidently. We see much consideration and concern about the particulars of when this fellow existed, what he did, what he got up to, and whereabouts did his primary work get done. And I think that this is something to be taken great note of. I'm going to quickly change over the chat incidentally, as well as the camera in particular. But as it were, such an interesting character that he seemed to be, even in his legend, that we aren't entirely certain where he lies in the historic record. As many figures of history, but in particular, one that has made such an incredible mark in the specific waging of war and the greater logistical network of all nations' militaries, that he doesn't have anything in particular that specifically anchors him to a period. I think that's mighty intriguing. All right. I have gotten a quick refrain from my tea, in case any of you are particularly interested in what I'm having to drink here. And I think it is now about time to get back to the reading. The text of Sun Tzu. I have found it difficult to glean much about the history of Sun Tzu's text. The quotations that occur in early authors go to show that the 13 chapters of which Sima Qian speaks were essentially the same as those now extant. We have his word for it that they were widely circulated in his day, and can only regret that he refrained from discussing them on that account. Sun Xingyin says in his preface, during the Qin and Han dynasties, Sun Tzu's art of war was in general use among the military. During the Qin and Han dynasties, Sun Tzu's art of war was in general use amongst military commanders, but they seem to have treated it as a work of mysterious import and were unwilling to expound it for the benefit of posterity. Thus it came about that Wei Wu was the first to write a commentary on it. As we have already seen, there is no reasonable ground to suppose that Cao Kung tampered with the text, but the text itself is often so obscure, and the number of editions which appeared from that time onward so great, especially during the Seng and Song dynasties, that it would be surprising if numerous corruptions had not managed to creep in. Towards the middle of the Song period, by which time all the chief commentaries on Sun Tzu were in existence, a certain Qi Tianpao published a work in 1521 entitled Sun Tzu, the Collected Commentaries of 10 Writers. There was another text with variant readings put forward by Chu Fu of Ta Xing, which also had supporters among the scholars of that period, but in the Ming editions, Sun Xingyin tells us these readings were for some reason or another no longer put into circulation. Thus, until the end of the 18th century, the text in sole possession of the field was one derived from Qi Tianpao's edition. From Qi Tianpao's edition, although no actual copy of that important work was known to have survived. That, therefore, in the text of Sun Tzu, which appears in the war section of the Great Imperial Encyclopedia, printed in 1726, the Kuqin Tushu Qi Cheng, another copy at my disposal of what is practically the same text with slight variations, is that contained in the 11 philosophers of Chu and Qin dynasties, 1758. And the Chinese printed in Captain Calthrop's first edition is evidently a similar version which is filtered through Japanese channels. So things remained until Sun Xingyin, 1752 through 1818, a distinguished antiquarian and classical scholar who claimed to be an actual descendant of Sun Wu, accidentally discovered a copy of Qi Tianpao's long-lost work when on a visit to the library of the Huayan Temple. Appended to it was the first shuo of Cheng Yu Xian. Appended to it was the work, first shuo of the given one at hand, Cheng Yu Xian mentioned in the Tungqi, and also believed to have perished. This is what Sun Xingyin designates as one or the other of the original edition or text, a rather misleading name, for it cannot by any means claim to set before us the text of Sun Tzu in its pristine purity. Qi Tianpao was a careless compiler, and appears to have been content to reproduce the somewhat debased version current in his day, without troubling to collate it with the earliest editions then available. Fortunately, 2 versions of Sun Tzu, even older than the newly discovered work, were still extant, one buried in the Tongtian, Tu Wu's great treatise on the Constitution, the other similarly enshrined in the Taiping Yu Lan Encyclopedia. In both the complete text is to be found, though split up into fragments, intermixed with other matter, and scattered piecemeal over a number of different sections. Considering that Yulan takes us back to the year 983, and the Tongtian about 200 years further still, to the middle of the Tang dynasty, the value of these early transcripts of Sun Tzu can hardly be overestimated. Yet the idea of utilizing them does not seem to have occurred to anyone until Sun Xingyin, acting under government instructions, undertook a thorough recension of the text. This is his own account. Because of the numerous mistakes in the text of Sun Tzu, which his editors had handed down, the government ordered that the ancient edition of Qi Tianpao should be used and that the text should be revised and corrected throughout. It happened that Wu Nianhu, the governor Pi Kwa, and Si, a graduate of the second degree, had all devoted themselves to this study, probably surpassing me therein. Accordingly, I have had the whole work cut on blocks as a textbook for military men. The three individuals he referred to had evidently been occupied on the text of Sun Tzu's prior correction. The three individuals he referred to had evidently been occupied on the text of Sun Tzu prior to Sun Xingyin's commission, but we are left in doubt as to the work they really accomplished. At any rate, the new edition, when ultimately produced, appeared in the names of Sun Xingyin and only one co-editor, Wu Jinqi. They took the original text as their basis, and by careful comparison with the older versions, as well as the extant commentaries and other sources of information, such as the first Shuo, for succeeding in restoring a very large number of doubtful passages, and turned out, on the whole, what must be accepted as the closest approximation we are ever likely to get to Sun Tzu's original work. This is what will hereafter be denominated the standard text. The copy which I have used belongs to a reissue dated 1877. It is in 6 pin, forming part of a well-printed set of 23 early philosophical works in 83 pin. It opens with a preface by Sun Xingyin, largely quoted in this introduction, vindicating the traditional view of Sun Tzu's life and performances, and summing up in remarkably concise fashion the evidence in its favor. This is followed by Cao Kong's preface to his edition and the biography of Sun Tzu from the Shi Qi, both translated above. Then come firstly Cheng Yu Xian's first Shuo, with author's preface, and next a short miscellany of historical and bibliographical information entitled Sun Tzu Xu Lu, compiled by Pi Isun. As regarded the body of the works, each separate sentence is followed by a note on the text, if required, and then by the various commentaries appertaining to it, arranged in chronologic order. These we shall now proceed to discuss briefly, one by one. The commentators. Sun Tzu can boast an exceptionally long and distinguished roll of commentators which would do honor to any classic. Wu Yangxiu remarks on this fact, though he wrote before the tale was complete, and rather ingeniously explains it by saying that the artifices of war, being inexhaustible, must therefore be susceptible of treatment in a great variety of ways. 1. Cao Cao, or Cao Kong, afterwards known as Wei Wu Ti, AD 155 through 220. There is hardly any room for doubt that the earliest commentary on Sun Tzu actually came from the pen of this extraordinary man, whose biography in the Sanquo Qi reads like a romance. One of the greatest military geniuses that the world has seen, and Napoleonic in the scale of its operations, he was especially famed for the marvelous rapidity of his marches, which has found expression in the line, "Talk of Cao Cao, and Cao Cao will appear." Mengxiu says of him that he was a great captain who measured his strength against Tongzhou, Lupu, and the two Yuan, father and son, and vanquished them all, whereupon he divided the empire of Han with Wu and Shu, and made himself king. It is recorded that whenever a council of war was held by Wei on the eve of a far-reaching campaign, he had all his calculations ready. Those generals who made use of them did not lose one battle in 10. Those who ran counter to them in any particular saw their armies incontinently beaten and put to flight. Cao Kung's notes on Sun Tzu, models of austere brevity, are so thoroughly characteristic of the stern commander known to history that it is hard indeed to conceive of them as the work of a mere literature. Sometimes, indeed, owing to extreme compression, they are scarcely intelligible and stand no less in need of a commentary than the text itself. As we have seen, Cao Kung is the reputed author of the given work, a book on war in 100,000 odd words, now lost but mentioned in another given work. 2. Mengxi. The commentary which has come down to us under this name is comparatively meager, and nothing about the author is known. Even his personal name has not been recorded. Qi Tianpao's edition places him after Qianlin, and Chao Kung Wu also assigns him to the Tang dynasty, but this is obviously a mistake, as his work is mentioned in another given work. In Sun Xinyan's preface, he appears as Mengxi of the Liang dynasty, 502 through 557. Others would identify him with Meng Kang of the 3rd century. In yet another work, he is named last of the 5 commentators, the others being Wei Wuti, Tu Mu, Qin Hao, and Qianlin. 3. Li Chuan of the 8th century was a well-known writer on military tactics. His work has been in constant use down to the present day. Said work, the work there mentions another, Lives of Famous Generals from the Chao to Tang Dynasty, as written by him. He is also generally supposed to be the real author of the popular Taoist tract, as it were. According to Cao Kung Wu and the Tianiko catalog, he followed the text of Sun Tzu, which differs considerably from those now extant. His notes are mostly short and to the point, and he frequently illustrates his remarks by anecdotes from Chinese history. 4. Tu Yu, died at 812, did not publish a separate commentary on Sun Tzu, his notes being taken from the Tongtian, the encyclopedic treatise on the Constitution, which was his life work. They are largely repetitions of Cao Kung and Mengxi, besides which it is believed that he drew on the ancient commentaries of Wang Ling and others. Owing to the peculiar arrangement of the Tongtian, he has to explain each passage on its merits, apart from the context, and sometimes his own explanation does not agree with that of Cao Kung, whom he always quotes first. Though not strictly to be reckoned as one of the 10 commentators, he was added to their number by the Qi Tianpao, being wrongly placed after his grandson, Tu Mu. Number 5. Tu Mu, 803 through 852, is perhaps best known as a poet, a bright star even in the glorious galaxy of A bright star even in the glorious galaxy of the Tang period. We learn from Chao Kung Wu that although he had no practical experience of war, he was extremely fond of discussing the subject, and was moreover well read in the military histories of Chunqiu and Changkuo eras. His notes, therefore, are well worth attention. They are very copious and replete with historical parallels. The gist of Sun Tzu's work is thus summarized by him: practice benevolence and justice, but on the other hand make full use of artifice and measures of expediency. He further declared that all the military triumphs and disasters of the 1,000 years which had elapsed since Sun Wu's death would, upon examination, be found to uphold and corroborate, in every particular, the maxims contained in his book. Tum Yu's somewhat spiteful charge against Cao Kung has already been considered elsewhere. Number 6. Qin Hao appears to have been a contemporary of Tu Mu. Chao Kung Wu says that he was impelled to write a new commentary on Sun Tzu because Cao Kung's, on the other hand, was too obscure and subtle, and that Tu Mu, on the other, too long-winded and diffuse. Wu Yangxiu, writing in the middle of the 11th century, calls Cao Kung, Tu Mu, and Qin Hao the three chief commentators on Sun Tzu, and observes that Qin Hao is continually attacking Tu Mu's shortcomings. His commentary, though not lacking in merit, must rank below those of his predecessors. Number 7. Xia Lin is known to have lived under the Tang dynasty, for his commentary on Sun Tzu is mentioned in that given work, and was afterwards republished by Qi Xie, of the same dynasty, together with those of Meng Shi and Tu Wu. It is of somewhat scanty texture, and in point of quality too, perhaps the least valuable of the 11. Number 8. Mei Yaoqin, 1002 through 1060, commonly known by his style as Mei Shengyu, was like Tu Mu, a poet of distinction. His commentary was published with a laudatory preface by the great Wu Yangxiu, from which we may cull the following. Later scholars have misread Sun Tzu, distorting his words and trying to make them square with their own one-sided views. Thus, though commentators have not been lacking, only a few have proved equal to the task. My friend Sheng Yu has not fallen into this mistake. In attempting to provide a critical commentary for Sun Tzu's work, he does not lose sight of the fact that these sayings were intended for states engaged in pardon me, this is a word unfamiliar. In attempting to provide a critical commentary for Sun Tzu's work, he does not lose sight of the fact that these sayings were intended for states engaged in internecine warfare. That the author is not concerned with the military conditions prevailing under the sovereigns of the three ancient dynasties, nor with the 9 punitive measures prescribed to the minister of war. Again, Sun Wu loved brevity of dictation, but his meaning is always deep. Whether the subject be marching an army, or handling soldiers, or estimating the enemy, or controlling the forces of victory, it is always systematically treated. The sayings are bound together in strict logical sequence, though this has been obscured by commentators who have probably failed to grasp their meaning. In his own commentary, Mei Shengyu has brushed aside all the obstinate prejudices of these critics, and has tried to bring out the true meaning of Sun Tzu himself. In this way, the clouds of confusion have been dispersed, and the sayings made clear. I am convinced that the present work deserves to be handed down side by side with the 3 great commentaries, and for a great deal that they find in the sayings, coming generations will have constant reason to thank my friend Sheng Yu. Making some allowance for the exuberance of friendship, I am inclined to endorse this favorable judgment, and would certainly place him above Qin Hao in order of merit. Number 9. Wang Si, of the Sung Dynasty, is decidedly original in some of his interpretations, but much less judicious than Mei Yaoqin. And on the whole, not a very trustworthy guide. He is fond of comparing his own commentary with that of Sokung, but the comparison is not often flattering to him. We learn that Chao Kungwu and that Wang Si revised the ancient text of Sun Tzu, filling up lacunae and correcting mistakes. Number 10. Ho Yin Si, of the Sung Dynasty. The personal name of this commentator is given as above by Cheng Xiao in the Tongqi, written about the middle of the 12th century, but he appears simply as Hoshi in the Yu Hai, and Ma Tuan Lin quotes Chao Kungwu as saying that his personal name is unknown. There seems to be no reason to doubt Cheng Xiao's statement. Otherwise, I should have been inclined to hazard a guess and identify him with one Ho Chufei, the author of a short treatise on war entitled, as it might have been, who lived in the latter part of the 11th century. Hoshi's commentary, in the words of the Tianiko catalog, contains helpful additions here and there, but is chiefly remarkable for the copious extracts taken in adapted form from the dynastic histories and other sources. 11. Cheng Yu. The list closes with a commentator of no great originality perhaps, but gifted with admirable powers of lucid exposition. His commentary is based on that of Cao Kung, whose terse sentences he contrives to expand and develop in masterly fashion. Without Cheng Yu, it is safe to say that much of Cao Kung's commentary would have remained cloaked in its pristine obscurity, and therefore valueless. His work is not mentioned in the Sung history, the Tongkao, or the Yu Hai, but it finds a niche in the Tongqi, which also names him as the author of the Lives of Famous Generals. It is rather remarkable that the last named four should all have flourished within so short a space of time. Chao Kungwu accounts for it by saying, during the early years of the Sung dynasty, the empire enjoyed a long spell of peace, and men ceased to practice the art of war. But when Chao Yuan Hao's rebellion came between 1032 and 1042, and the frontier generals were defeated time after time, the court made strenuous inquiry for men skilled in war, and military topics became the vogue amongst all the high officials. Hence it is that the commentators of Sun Tzu in our dynasty belong mainly to that period. Besides these 11 commentators, there are several others whose work has not come down to us. The Suishu mentions 4, namely Wang Ling, often quoted by Tu Yu as such, Cheng Zhu Cheng, Chia Su of Wei, and Xin Yu of Wu. The Tengshu adds Sun Hao as the Tongqi, Xiaoqi, while the Tu Shu mentions a Ming commentator, Huang Junyu. It is possible that some of these may have been merely collectors and editors of other commentaries like Qi Tianpao and Qi Xie, mentioned above. Certainly in the case of the latter, the entry in the Tongkao, without the following note, would give one to understand that he had written an independent commentary of his own. There are 2 works described in Suku Qianshu. Described in the Suku Qian... described in the Suku Qianshu, and no doubt extremely rare, which I should much like to have seen. One is entitled, as it were, in 5 Qian. It gives selections from 4 new commentators, probably of the Ming Dynasty, as well as from the 11 known to us. The names of the 4 are Xie Yuan, Chang Ao, Li Cai, and Huang Qicheng. The other work is, as it were, in 4 Qian, compiled by Cheng Tuan of the present dynasty. It is a compendium of information on ancient warfare, with special reference to Sun Tzu's 13 chapters. Appreciations of Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu has exercised a potent fascination over the minds of some of China's greatest men. Among the famous generals who are known to have studied his pages with enthusiasm may be mentioned Han Xin, dated BC 196, Feng I, dated AD 34, Lu Meng, dated 219, and Yo Fei, 1103 through 1141. The opinion of Cao Kung, who disputes with Han Xin the highest place in the Chinese military annals, has already been recorded. Still more remarkable in one way is the testimony of purely literary men, such as Su Sun, the father of Su Tongbo, who wrote several essays on military topics, all of which owe their chief inspiration to Sun Tzu. The following short passage by him is preserved in the Yu Hai. Sun Wu sang that it is different. Sun Wu sang that in war one cannot make certain of conquering is very different indeed from what other books tell us. Wu Qi was a man of the same stamp. Wu Qi was a man of the same stamp as Sun Wu. They both wrote books on war, and they are linked together in popular speech as Sun and Wu. But Wu Qi's remarks on war are less weighty. His rules are rougher and more crudely stated, and there is not the same unity of plan as in Sun Tzu's work, where the style is terse but the meaning fully brought out. That, as such, chapter 17, contains the following extract from, as it were, Impartial Judgments in the Garden of Literature by Cheng Hao. Sun Tzu's 13 chapters are not only the staple and base of all military men's training, but also compel the most careful attention of scholars and men of letters. His sayings are terse yet elegant, simple yet profound, perspicuous and eminently practical. And eminently practical. Such works as the Lun Yu, the First Qing, and the Great Commentary, as well as the writings of Mencius, Sun Quang, and Yang Chu, all fall below the level of Sun Tzu. Chu Si, commenting on this, fully admits the first part of the criticism, although he dislikes the audacious comparison with the venerated classical works. Language of this sort, he says, encourages a ruler's bent towards unrelenting warfare and reckless militarism. Apologies for war. Accustomed as we are to think of China as the greatest peace-loving nation on earth, we are in some danger forgetting that her experience of war, in all its phases, has also been such as no modern state can parallel. Her long military annals stretch back to a point at which they are lost in the mists of time. She had built the Great Wall and was maintaining a huge standing army along her frontier centuries before the first Roman legionary was seen on the Danube. What with the perpetual collisions of ancient feudal states, the grim conflicts with Huns, Turks, and other invaders after the centralization of government, the terrific upheavals which accompanied the overthrow of so many dynasties, besides the countless rebellions and minor disturbances that have flamed up and flickered out again one by one, it is hardly too much to say that the clash of arms has never ceased to resound in one portion or another of the empire. No less remarkable is the succession of illustrious captains to whom China can point with pride. As in all countries, the greatest are found emerging at the most fateful crises of history. Thus, Po Chi stands out conspicuous. Thus, Po Chi stands out conspicuous in the period when Qin was entering upon her final struggle with the remaining independent states. The stormy years which followed the breakup of the Qin dynasty are illumined by the transcendent genius of Han Xin. When the house of Han is turned to tottering to its fall, the great and baleful figure of Cao Cao's When the house of Han in turn is tottering to its fall, the great and baleful figure of Cao Cao dominates the scene. And in the establishment of the Tang dynasty, one of the mightiest tasks achieved by man, the superhuman energy of Li Shimin, afterwards the Emperor Taizong, was seconded by the brilliant strategy of Li Qing. None of these generals need fear comparison with the greatest names in the military history of Europe. In spite of all this, the great body of Chinese sentiment, from Lao Tzu downwards, and especially as reflected in the standard literature of Confucianism, has been consistently pacific and intensely opposed to militarism in any form. It is such an uncommon thing to find any of the literati defending warfare on principle that I have thought it worthwhile to collect and translate a few passages in which the unorthodox view is upheld. The following by Sima Qian shows that for all his ardent admiration of Confucius, he was yet no advocate of peace at any price. Military weapons are the means used by the sage to punish violence and cruelty, to give peace to troubles. Military weapons are the means used by the sage to punish violence and cruelty, to give peace to troublous times, to remove difficulties and dangers, and to succor those who are in peril. Every animal with blood in its veins and horns on its head will fight when it is attacked. How much more so will man, who carries in his breast the faculties of love and hatred and joy? How much more so will man, who carries in his breast the faculties of love and hatred, joy and anger? When he is pleased, a feeling of affection springs up within him. When angry, his poison sting is brought to play. When angry, his poison sting is brought into play. That is the natural law which governs his being. What then shall be said of those scholars of our time, blind to all great issues and without any appreciation of relative values, who can only bark out their stale formulas about virtue and civilization, condemning the use of military weapons? They will surely bring our country to impotence and dishonor, and the loss of her rightful heritage, or, at the very least, they will bring about invasion and rebellion, sacrifice of territory and general enfeeblement. Yet they obstinately refuse to modify the position they have taken up. The truth is that, just as in the family, the teacher must not spare the rod, and punishments cannot be dispensed with in the state, so military chastisement can never be allowed to fall into abeyance in the empire. All one can say is that this power will be exercised wisely by some, foolishly by others, and that among those who bear arms some will be loyal, and others rebellious. The next piece is taken from Tu Mu's preface to his commentary on Sun Tzu. War may be defined as punishment, which is one of the functions of government. It was the profession of Cheng Yu and Zhan Qiu, both disciples of Confucius. Nowadays, the holding of trials and hearing of litigation, the imprisonment of offenders, and their execution by flogging in the marketplace are all done by officials. But the wielding of huge armies, the throwing down of fortified cities, the hailing of women and children into captivity, and the beheading of traitors, this is also work which is done by officials. The objects of the rack and the military The objects of the rack and of military weapons are essentially the same. There is no intrinsic difference between the punishment of flogging and cutting off heads in war. For the lesser infractions of law, which are easily dealt with, only a small amount of force need be employed. Hence the institution of torture and flogging. For more serious outbreaks of lawlessness, which are hard to suppress, a greater amount of force is necessary. Hence the use of military weapons and wholesale decapitation. In both cases, however, the end in view is to get rid of wicked people and to give comfort and relief to the good. Ji-sun asked John Yu, saying, "Have you, sir, acquired your military aptitude by study, or is it innate?" John Yu replied, "It has been acquired by study." "How can that be so?" said Ji-sun, "seeing that you are a disciple of Confucius." "It is a fact," replied John Yu. "I was taught by Confucius. It is fitting that the great sage should exercise both civil and military functions, though to be sure my instruction in the art of fighting has not yet gone very far." Now, who the author was of this rigid distinction between the civil and the military, and the limitation of each to a separate sphere of action, or in what year of which dynasty it was first introduced, is more than I can say. But at any rate, it has come about that the members of the governing class are quite afraid of enlarging on military topics, or do so only in a shamefaced manner. If any are bold enough to discuss the subject, they are at once set down as eccentric individuals of coarse and brutal propensities. This is an extraordinary instance of the way in which, through sheer lack of reasoning, men unhappily lose sight of fundamental principles. When the Duke of Chu was minister under Cheng Wang, he regulated ceremonies and made music, and venerated the arts of scholarship and learning. Yet when the barbarians of the river Hui revolted, he sallied forth and chastised them. When Confucius held office under the Duke of Lu, and a meeting was convened at Jiaku, he said, "If pacific negotiations are in progress, warlike preparations should have been made beforehand." He rebuked and shamed the Marquis of Qi, who cowered under him and dared not proceed to violence. How can it be said that these two great sages had no knowledge of military matters? We have seen that the great Chu Si held Sun Tzu in high esteem. He also appeals to the authority of the classics. Our master Confucius, answering Duke Ling of Wei, said, "I have never studied matters connected with armies and battalions." Replying to Kung Win-su, he said, "I have not been instructed about buff coats and weapons." But if we turn to the meeting at Jiaku, we find that he used armed force against the men of Lai, so that the Marquis of Qi was overawed. Again, when the inhabitants of Pai revolted, he ordered his officers to attack them, whereupon they were defeated and fled in confusion. He once uttered the words, "If I fight, I conquer." And John Yu also said, "The sage exercises both civil and military functions. Can it be a fact that Confucius never studied or received instruction in the art of war? We can only say that he did not specifically choose matters connected with armies and fighting to be the subject of his teaching." Sun Xing Yin, the editor of Sun Tzu, writes in similar strain. Confucius said, "I am unversed in military matters." He also said, "If I fight, I conquer." Confucius ordered ceremonies and regulated music. Now, war constitutes one of the 5 classes of the state ceremonial, and must not be treated as an independent branch of study. Hence, the words, "I am unversed in," must be taken to mean that there are things which even an inspired teacher does not know. Those who have to lead an army and devise stratagems must learn the art of war. But if one can command the services of a good general like Sun Tzu, who was employed by Wu Su Shu, there is no need to learn it oneself. Hence the remark added by Confucius, "If I fight, I conquer." The men of the present day, however, willfully interpret these words of Confucius in their narrowest sense, as though he meant that books on the art of war were not worth reading. With blind persistency, they adduce the example of Chao Qua, who pored over his father's books to no purpose, as a proof that all military theory is useless. Again, seeing that books on war have to do with such things as opportunism in designing plans and the conversion of spies, they hold that the art is immoral and unworthy of a sage. These people ignore the fact that the studies of our scholars and the civil administration of our officials also require steady application and practice before efficiency is reached. The ancients were particularly chary of allowing mere novices to botch their work. Weapons are painful and fighting perilous, and unless a general is in constant practice, he ought not to hazard other men's lives in battle. Hence, it is essential that Sun Tzu's 13 chapters should be studied. Xiang Liang used to instruct his nephew Qi in the art of war. She got a rough idea of the art in its general bearings, but would not peruse the studies to their proper outcome, the consequence being that he was finally defeated and overthrown. He did not realize that the tricks and artifices of war are beyond verbal computation. Duke Xiang of Sung and King Yin of Su were brought to destruction by their misplaced humanity. The treacherous and underhand nature of war necessitates the use of guile and stratagem suited to the occasion. There is a case on record of Confucius himself having violated an extorted oath, and also of his having left the Sung state in disguise. Can we then recklessly arraign Sun Tzu for disregarding truth and honesty? Okay, so that was, in fact, a particularly long bout, but we have gotten through that section. And now for more tea. I should declare, for those which are watching, or will be watching, the specific length of the reading is essentially going to be determined by how long my voice can hold out. This will almost certainly be a multi-part series, admittedly. That being as it were. With another sip of my tea, I say, I have a lot of familiarity with this particular book, in this particular sentimentality, as it were. Though the declarations for my desire to begin the channel proper with this were cut off by the fact that this is the very first time, and technical difficulties are inevitable. The notions contained in this section very well epitomize my thoughts on the matter. Although there's much to be said for civility as it is demonstrably sort of extricated or otherwise separated from militaria and the military edifice, as it were. These things ultimately are interrelated, and they always will be, for a state is a great body, and as we hear it, state is often used in direct relation to the notion of a body. Perhaps some perceive this in the literal sense, but it certainly at least exists in the formal abstract sense. That is to say, if a body exists without some means of at minimum self-defense, well, it's not liable to be a body for very long. And I do believe that ultimately history proves this out, as it were. And in that, this particular tome that I picked up, thanks to actually one of my teachers back in high school, he happened to have a copy of it lying around his classroom, and he was kindly enough to allow me to use it. Enabled me to get a very significant head start into thinking about these matters as they apply. For while I am not a state unto myself by any means, I am a body. And so is everybody who would otherwise be listening. Save for the robots that are analyzing the content as they were. We are all bodies. And so we all need some extent of defense. Not in exclusively the literal sense, but absolutely the abstract sense, if nothing else. Humanity is humanity, and humanity contains multiplicity. In multiplicity, you have the good and the bad. So you ultimately need it, no matter what. So, a little bit of personal commentary interspliced. Let us then continue. We will not go through the bibliography. As I say, we will be attempting to keep annotations to a minimum. And so, here we are, finally, at the actual works themselves. And let's get settled in. This one I will attempt to keep closer to the 30-minute mark for our breaks and everything. Chapter 1. Laying Plans. This is the only possible meaning of such, which M. Emio and Captain Calthrop wrongly translate Fondements de l'art militaire, and First Principles, respectively. Saokung says it refers to the deliberations in the temple selected by the general for his contemporary use, or as we should say, in his tent. And that is perhaps the last bit of commentary that I'll be reading from Mr. Giles, respectable as he were. Laying Plans, Chapter 1. Rule 1. Sun Tzu said, "The art of war is of vital importance to the state." Rule 2. It is a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or to ruin. Hence it is a subject of inquiry which can on no account be neglected. Rule 3. The art of war, then, is governed by 5 constant factors to be taken into account in one's deliberations when seeking to determine the conditions obtaining in the field. Rule 4. These are: number 1, the moral law; number 2, heaven; number 3, earth; number 4, the commander; number 5, method and discipline; number 5, Rule 5, which has not been translated for us. Rule 6. The moral law causes the people to be in complete accord with their ruler, so that they will follow him regardless of their lives, undismayed by any danger. Rule 7. Heaven signifies night and day, cold and heat, times and seasons. Rule 8. Earth comprises distances, great and small, danger and security, open ground and narrow passes, the chances of life and death. Rule 9. The commander stands for the virtues of wisdom, sincerity, benevolence, courage, and strictness. Rule 10. By method and discipline are to be understood the marshalling of the army in its proper subdivisions, the gradations of rank among the officers, the maintenance of roads by which supplies may reach the army, and the control of military expenditure. Rule 11. These 5 heads should be familiar to every general. He who knows them will be victorious. He who knows them not will fail. Rule 12. Therefore, in your deliberations, when seeking to determine the military conditions, let them be made the basis of a comparison in this wise. Rule 13. Number 1. Which of the 2 sovereigns is imbued with the moral law? Number 2. Which of the 2 generals has most ability? Number 3. With whom lie the advantages derived from heaven and earth? Number 4. On which side is discipline most rigorously enforced? Number 5. Which army is the stronger? Number 6. On which side are officers and men more highly trained? Number 7. In which army is there the greater constancy both in reward and punishment? Rule 14. By means of these 7 considerations, I can forecast victory or defeat. Rule 15. The general that hearkens to my counsel and acts upon it will conquer. Let such a one be retained in command. The general that hearkens not to my counsel nor acts upon it will suffer defeat. Let such a one be dismissed. Correction. Rule 16. While heeding the profit of my counsel, avail yourself also of any helpful circumstances over and beyond the ordinary rules. Rule 17. According as circumstances are favorable, one should modify one's plans. Rule 18. All warfare is based on deception. Rule 19. Hence, when able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. Rule 20. Hold out baits to entice the enemy, feign disorder, and crush him. Rule 21. If he is secure at all points, be prepared for him. If he is in superior strength, evade him. Rule 22. If your opponent is of choleric temper, seek to irritate him. Pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant. Rule 23. If he is taking his ease, give him no rest. If his forces are united, separate them. Rule 24. Attack him where he is unprepared. Appear where you are not expected. Rule 25. These military devices leading to victory must not be divulged beforehand. Rule 26. Now the general who wins a battle makes many calculations in his temple ere the battle is fought. The general who loses a battle makes but few calculations beforehand. Thus do many calculations lead to victory, and few calculations to defeat. How much more? No calculation at all. It is by attention to this point that I can foresee who is likely to win or lose. Chapter 2. Waging War. Rule number 1. Sun Tzu said, "In the operations of war, where there are in the field 1,000 swift chariots, as many heavy chariots, and 100,000 mail-clad soldiers, with provisions enough to carry 1,000..." Correction. Sun Tzu said, "In the operations of war, where there are in the field 1,000 swift chariots, as many heavy chariots, and 100,000 mail-clad soldiers, with provisions enough to carry them 1,000 li. The expenditure at home and at the front, including entertainment of guests, small items such as glue and paint, and some spent on chariots and armor, will reach the total of 1,000 ounces of silver per day. Such is the cost of raising an army of 100,000 men." Rule 2. When you engage in actual fighting, if victory is long in coming, the men's weapons will grow dull, and their ardor will be dampened. If you lay siege to a town, you will exhaust your strength. Rule 3. Again, if the campaign is protracted, the resources of the state will not be equal to the strain. Rule 4. Now, when your weapons are dulled, your ardor dampened, your strength exhausted, and your treasure spent, other chieftains will spring up to take advantage of your extremity. Then no man, however wise, will be able to avert the consequences that must ensue. Rule 5. Thus, though we have heard of stupid haste in war, cleverness has never been associated with long delays. Rule 6. There is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. Rule 7. It is only one who is thoroughly acquainted with the evils of war that can thoroughly understand the profitable way of carrying it on. Rule 8. The skillful soldier does not raise a second levy, neither are his supply wagons loaded more than twice. Rule 9. Bring war material with you from home, but forage on the enemy. Thus the army will have enough food for its needs. Rule 10. Poverty of the state exchequer causes an army to be maintained by contributions from a distance. Contributing to maintain an army at a distance causes the people to be impoverished. Rule 11. On the other hand, the proximity of an army causes prices to go up, and high prices cause the people's substance to be drained away. Rule 12. When their substance is drained away, the peasantry will be afflicted by heavy extractions. Correction. When their subsistence is drained away, the peasantry will be afflicted by heavy exactions. Rule 13 remains untranslated. Rule 14. With this loss of substance and exhaustion of strength, The homes of the people will be stripped bare, and 3/10 of their incomes will be dissipated, while government expenses for broken chariots, worn-out horses, breastplates and helmets, bows and arrows, spears and shields, protective mantlets, draught up. Correction. With this loss of substance and exhaustion of strength, the homes of the people will be stripped bare, and 3/10 of their incomes will be dissipated, while government expenses for broken chariots, worn-out horses, breastplates and helmets, bows and arrows, spears and shields, protective mantlets, draft oxen, and heavy wagons will mount to 4/10 of its total revenue. Rule 15. Hence, a wise general makes a point of foraging on the enemy. 1 cartload of the enemy's provisions is equivalent to 20 of one's own, and likewise a single picule of his provender is equivalent to 20 from one's own store. Rule 16. Now, in order to kill the enemy, our men must be roused to anger. That there may be advantage from defeating the enemy, they must have their rewards. Rule 17. Therefore, in chariot fighting, when 10 or more chariots have been taken, those should be rewarded who took the first. Our own flags should be substituted for those of the enemy, and the chariots mingled and used in conjunction with ours. The captured soldiers should be kindly treated and kept. Rule 18. This is called using the conquered foe to augment one's own strength. Rule 19. In war, then, let your great object be victory, not lengthy campaigns. Rule 20. Thus it may be known that the leader of armies is the arbiter of the people's fate, the man on whom it depends whether the nation shall be in peace or in peril. Okay, so it's been another 30 minutes, and time for more tea, and a bit of a bathroom break. May you all enjoy the background music as I will be right back. and we are back. Oh. And there we are. All right, so now we finally get into chapter number 3. Chapter number 3. Attack by Stratagem. Rule number 1. Sun Tzu said, "In the practical art of war, the best thing of all is to take the enemy's country whole and intact. To shatter and destroy it is no..." Correction. To shatter and destroy it is not so good. So too, it is better to capture an entire army than to destroy it. To capture a regiment, a detachment, or a company entire than to destroy them. Rule 2. Hence to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Rule 3. Thus, the highest form of generalship is to balk the enemy's plans. The next best is to prevent the junction of the enemy's forces. The next in order is to attack the enemy's army in the field. And the worst policy of all is to besiege walled cities. Rule number 4. The rule is not to besiege walled cities if it can possibly be avoided. The preparation of mantlets, movable shelters, and various implements of war will take up to 3 whole months. And the piling up of mounds over against the walls will take 3 months more. Rule number 5. The general, unable to control his irritation, will launch his men to the assault like swarming ants, with the result that 1/3 of his men are slain, while the town remains untaken. Such are the disastrous effects of a siege. Rule number 6. Therefore, the skillful leader subdues the enemy's troops without any fighting. He captures their cities without laying siege to them. He overthrows their kingdom without lengthy operations in the field. Rule number 7. With his forces intact, he will dispute the mastery of the empire, and thus, without losing a man, his triumph will be complete. This is the method of attacking by stratagem. Rule number 8. It is the rule in war, if our forces are 10 to the enemy's 1, to surround him, if 5 to 1, to attack him, if twice as numerous, to divide our army in 2. Rule number 9. If equally matched, we can still offer battle. If slightly inferior in numbers, we can avoid the enemy. If quite unequal in every way, we can flee from him. Rule number 10. Hence, though an obstinate fight may be made by a small force, in the end it must be captured by the larger force. Rule number 11. Now the general is the bulwark of the state. If the bulwark is complete at all points, the state will be strong. If the bulwark is defective, the state will be weak. Rule number 12. There are 3 ways in which a ruler can bring misfortune upon his army. Rule number 13. Number 1. By commanding the army to advance or to retreat, being ignorant of the fact that it cannot obey. This is called hobbling the army. Rule number 14. Number 2. By attempting to govern an army in the same way as he administers a kingdom, being ignorant of the conditions which obtain in an army. This causes restlessness in the soldiers' minds. Rule number 15. Number 3. By employing the officers of his army without discrimination, through ignorance of the military principle of adaptation to circumstances. This shakes the confidence of the This shakes the confidence of the soldiers. Rule number 16. But when the army is restless and distrustful, trouble is sure to come from the other feudal princes. This is simply bringing anarchy into the army and flinging victory away. Rule number 17. Thus, we may know that there are 5 essentials for victory. Number 1. He will win who knows when to fight and when not to fight. Number 2. He will win who knows how to handle both superior and inferior forces. Number 3. He will win whose army is animated by the same spirit throughout all its ranks. Number 4. He will win who prepared himself, waits to take the enemy unprepared. Number 5. He will win who has military capacity and is not interfered with by the sovereign. Victory lies in the knowledge of these 5 points. Rule 18. Hence the saying, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained you will also... If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Chapter 4. Tactical Dispositions. Rule number 1. Sun Tzu said, "The good fighters of old first put themselves beyond the possibility of defeat, and then waited for an opportunity of defeating the enemy." Rule number 2. To secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands, but the opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself. Rule number 3. Thus, the good fighter is able to secure himself against defeat, but cannot make certain of defeating the enemy. Rule number 4. Hence the saying, one may know how to conquer without being able to do it. Rule number 5. Security against defeat implies defensive tactics. Ability to defeat the enemy means taking the offensive. Rule number 6. Standing on the defensive indicates insufficient strength, attacking a superabundance of strength. Rule number 7. The general who is skilled in defense hides in the most secret recess of the earth. He who is skilled in attack flashes forth from the topmost heights of heaven. Thus, on the one hand, we have the ability to protect ourselves. Thus, on the one hand, we have ability to protect ourselves. On the other, a victory that is complete. Rule number 8. To see victory only when it is within the ken of the common herd is not the acme of excellence. Rule number 9. Neither is it the acme of excellence if you fight and conquer the whole... Neither is it the acme of excellence if you fight and conquer and the whole empire says, "Well done." Rule number 10. To lift an autumn hair is no sign of great strength. To see sun and moon is no sign of sharp sight. To hear the noise of thunder is no sight of a quick ear. Rule number 11. What the ancients called a clever fighter is one who not only wins, but excels in winning with ease. Rule number 12. Hence, his victories bring him neither reputation for wisdom nor credit for courage. Rule number 13. He wins his battle. Correction. He wins his battles by making no mistakes. Making no mistakes is what establishes the certainty of victory, for it means conquering an enemy that is already defeated. Rule number 14. Hence, the skillful fighter puts himself into a position which makes defeat impossible, and does not miss the moment for defeating the enemy. Rule number 15. Thus it is that in war the victorious strategist only seeks battle after the victory has been won, whereas he who is destined to defeat first fights and afterwards looks for victory. Rule number 16. The consummate leader cultivates the moral law and strictly adheres to method and discipline. Thus, it is in his power to control success. Rule 17. In respect of military method, we have, firstly, measurement, secondly, estimation of quantity, thirdly, calculation, fourthly, balancing of chances, fifthly, victory. Rule number 18. Measurement owes its existence to earth, estimation of quantity to measurement, calculation to estimation of quantity, balancing of chances to calculation, and victory to balancing of chances. Rule number 19. A victorious army opposed to a routed one is as a pound's weight placed in the scale against a single grain. Rule 20. The onrush of a conquering force is like the bursting of pent-up waters into a chasm 1,000 fathoms deep. So much for tactical dispositions. Chapter 5. Energy. Rule number 1. Sun Tzu said, "The control of a large force is the same in principle as the control of a few men. It is merely a question of dividing up their numbers." Rule number 2. Fighting with a large army under your command is no wise different from fighting with a small one. It is merely a question of instituting correction. It is merely a question of instituting signs and signals. Rule number 3. To ensure that your whole host may withstand the brunt of the enemy's attack and remain unshaken, this is effected by This is effected by maneuvers direct and indirect. Rule number 4. That the impact of your army may be like a grindstone dashed against an egg. This is effected by the science of weak points and strong. Rule number 5. In all fighting, the direct method may be used for joining battle, but indirect methods will be needed in order to secure victory. Rule number 6. Indirect tactics efficiently applied are inexhaustible, as heaven and earth, unending as the flow of rivers and streams. Like the sun and moon, they end but to begin anew. Like the 4 seasons, they pass away but to return once more. Rule number 7. There are not more than 5 musical notes. Yet the combinations of these 5 give rise to more melodies than can ever be heard. Rule number 8. There are not more than 5 primary colors, yet in combination they produce more hues than can ever be seen. Rule number 9. There are not more than 5 cardinal tastes, yet combinations of them yield more flavors than can ever be tasted. Rule number 10. In battle, there are not more than 2 methods of attack, the direct and the indirect, yet these 2 in combination give rise to an endless series of maneuvers. Rule number 11. The direct and indirect lead onto each other in turn. It is like moving in a circle. You never come to an end. Who can exhaust the possibilities of their combination? Rule number 12. The onset of troops is like the rush of a torrent which will even roll stones along in its course. Rule number 13. The quality of decision is like the well-timed swoop of a falcon, which enables it to strike and destroy its victim. Rule number 14. Therefore, the good fighter will be terrible in his onset and prompt in his decision. Rule number 15. Rule number 15. Energy may be likened to the bending of a crossbow, decision to the releasing of the trigger. Rule number 16. Amid the turmoil and tumult of battle, there may be seeming disorder and yet no real disorder at all. Amid confusion and chaos, your array may be without head or tail, yet it will be proof against defeat. Rule number 17. Simulated disorders postulates perfect discipline. Simulated fear postulates courage. Simulated weakness postulates strength. Rule number 18. Hiding order beneath the cloak of disorder is simply a question of subdivision. Concealing courage under a show of timidity presupposes a fund of latent energy. Masking strength with weakness is to be effected by tactical dispositions. Rule number 19. Thus, one who is skillful at keeping the enemy on the move maintains deceitful appearances, according to which the enemy will act. He sacrifices something, that the enemy may snatch at it. Rule number 20. By holding out baits, he keeps him on the march, then with a body of picked men, he lies in wait for them. Rule number 21. The clever combatant looks to the effect of combined energy and does not require too much from individuals. Hence his ability to pick out the right men and to utilize combined energy. Rule number 22. When he utilizes combined energy, his fighting men become as it were like unto rolling logs or stones. For it is the nature of a log or stone to remain motionless on level ground, and to move when on a slope. It's four-cornered to come to a standstill, but if round-shaped, to go rolling down. Rule number 23. Thus, the energy developed by good fighting men is as the momentum of a round stone rolled down a mountain, thousands of feet in height. So much on the subject of energy. Chapter 6. Weak Points and Strong. Rule number 1. Sun Tzu said, "Whoever is first in the field and awaits the coming of the enemy will be fresh for the flight." Will be fresh for the fight. Whoever is second in the field and has to hasten to battle will arrive exhausted. Rule number 2. Therefore the clever combatant imposes his will on the enemy, but does not allow the enemy's will to be imposed on him. Rule number 3. By holding out advantages to him, he can cause the enemy to approach of his own accord, or by inflicting damage, he can make it impossible for the enemy to draw near. Rule number 4. If the enemy is taking his ease, he can harass him. If well supplied with food, he can starve him out. If quietly encamped, he can force him to move. Rule number 5. Appear at points which the enemy must hasten to defend. March swiftly to places where you are not expected. Rule number 6. An army may march great distances without distress if it marches through country where the enemy is not. Rule number 7. You can be sure of succeeding in your attacks if you only attack places which are undefended. You can ensure the safety of your defense if you only hold positions that cannot be attacked. Rule number 8. Hence that general is skillful in attack whose opponent does not know what to defend, and he is skillful in defense whose opponent's And he is skillful in defense whose opponent does not know what to attack. Rule number 9. O divine art of subtlety and secrecy! Through you we learn to be invisible, through you inaudible, and hence we can hold the enemy's fate in our hands. Rule number 10. You may advance to be absolutely irresistible if you make for the enemy's weak points. You may retire and be safe from pursuit if your movements are more rapid than those of the enemy. Rule number 11. If we wish to fight, the enemy can be forced to an engagement even though he be sheltered behind a high rampart and a deep ditch. All we need to do is to attack some other place that he will be obliged to relieve. Rule number 12. If we do not wish to fight, we can prevent the enemy from engaging us even through If we do not wish to fight, we can prevent the enemy from engaging us even though the lines of our encampment be merely traced out on the ground. All we need do is to throw something odd and unaccountable in his way. Rule number 13. By discovering the enemy's dispositions and remaining invisible ourselves, we can keep our forces concentrated, while the enemy's must be divided. Rule number 14. We can form a single united body, while the enemy must split up into fractions. Hence, there will be a whole pitted against separate parts of a whole, which means that we shall be many to the enemy's few. Rule 15. And if we are able thus to attack an inferior force with a superior one, our opponents will be in dire straits. Rule number 16. The spot where we intend to fight must not be made known, for then the enemy will have to prepare against a possible attack at several different points, and his forces being thus distributed in many directions, the numbers we shall have to face at any given point will be proportionately few. Rule number 17. For should the enemy strengthen his van, he will weaken his rear. Should he strengthen his rear, he will weaken his van. Should he strengthen his left, he will weaken his right. Should he strengthen his right, he will weaken his left. If he sends reinforcements everywhere, he will everywhere be weak. Rule number 18. Numerical weakness comes from having to prepare against possible attacks. Numerical strength from compelling our adversary to make these preparations against us. Rule number 19. Knowing the place and the time of the upcoming battle, we may concentrate from the greatest distances in order to fight. Rule number 20. But if neither time nor place be known, then the left wing will be impotent to succor the right equally impotent to succor the left, the van unable to relieve the rear, or the rear to support the van. How much more so if the furthest portions of the army are anything under 100 li apart, and even the nearest are separated by several li. Rule 21. Though according to my estimate, the soldiers of UA exceed our own in number, that shall advantage them nothing in the matter of victory. I say then that victory can be achieved. Rule 22. Though the enemy be stronger in numbers, we may prevent him from fighting. Scheme so as to discover his plans and the likelihood of their success. Rule 23. Rouse him and learn the principle of his activity or inactivity. Force him to reveal himself, so as to find out his vulnerable spots. Rule number 24. Carefully compare the opposing army with your own, so that you may know where strength is superabundant and where it is deficient. Rule number 25. In making tactical dispositions, the highest pitch you can attain is to conceal them. Conceal your dispositions, and you will be safe from the prying of the subtlest spies, from the machinations of the wisest brains. Rule 26. How victory may be produced for them out of the enemy's own tactics, that is what the multitude cannot comprehend. Rule 27. All men can see the tactics whereby I conquer, but what none can see is the strategy out of which victory is evolved. Rule 28. Do not repeat the tactics which have gained you one victory, but let your methods be regulated by the infinite variety of circumstances. Rule 29. Military tactics are like unto water, for water in its natural course runs away from high places. For water in its natural course runs away from high places and hastens downwards. Rule number 30. So in war, the way is to avoid what is strong and to strike at what is weak. Rule number 31. Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe whom he is facing. Rule 32. Therefore, just as water retains no constant shape, so in warfare there are no constant conditions. Rule 33. He who can modify his tactics in relation to his opponent and thereby succeed in winning may be called a heaven-born captain. Rule 34. The 5 elements are not always equally predominant. The 4 seasons may... The 4 seasons make way for each other in turn. There are short days and long. The moon has its periods of waning and waxing. Okay. Time for another little break. So, we have indeed gotten a good way through here. Oh, I'd say about a quarter of the way. And we're making good time, I think. And so we shall continue. And thank you, Egg. Much appreciated. Always happy to have a little bit of appreciation piled on. And it looks like we do have a few things to attend to, so I will be right back. Alright, and we do return. So let us continue. Chapter 7. Let me check to see. Yes, okay, everything is still on. Chapter number 7. Manoeuvring. Rule number 1. Sun Tzu said, "In war, the general receives his commands from the sovereign." Rule number 2. Having collected an army and concentrated his forces, he must blend and harmonize the different elements thereof before pitching his camp. Rule number 3. After that comes tactical maneuvering, than which there is nothing more difficult. The difficulty of tactical maneuvering consists in turning the devious into the direct, and misfortune into gain. Rule number 4. Thus, to take a long and circuitous route, after enticing the enemy out of the way, and those starting after him, to contrive to reach the goal before him, shows knowledge of the artifice of deviation. Rule number 5. Maneuvering with an army is advantageous, with an undisciplined multitude most dangerous. Rule number 6. If you set a fully equipped army in march in order to snatch an advantage, the chances are that you will be too late. On the other hand, to detach a flying column for the purpose involves the sacrifice of its baggage and stores. Rule number 7. Thus, if you order your men to roll up their buff coats and make forced marches without halting day or night, covering double the usual distance at a stretch, doing 100 li in order to wrest an advantage, the leaders of all your 3 divisions will fall into the hands of the enemy. Rule number 8. The stronger men will be in front, the jaded ones will fall behind, and on this plan, only 1/10 of your army will reach its destination. Rule number 9. If you march 50 li in order to outmaneuver the enemy, you will lose the header of your first division, and only half your force will reach the goal. Rule number 10. If you march 30 li with the same object, 2/3 of your army will arrive. Rule number 11. We may take it then that an army without its baggage train is lost. Without provisions, it is lost. Without basis of supply, it is lost. Rule number 12. We cannot enter into alliances until we are acquainted with the designs of our neighbors. Rule number 13. We are not fit to lead an army on the march unless we are familiar with the face of the country, its mountains and forests, its pitfalls and precipices, its marshes and swamps. Rule number 14. We shall be unable to turn natural advantages to account unless we make use of local guides. Rule number 15. In war, practice dissimulation, and you will succeed. Move only if there is a real advantage to be gained. Rule number 16. Whether to concentrate or to divide your troops must be decided by circumstances. Rule number 17. Let your rapidity be that of the wind, your compactness that of the forest. Rule number 18. In raiding and plundering, be like fire, in immovability like a mountain. Rule number 19. Let your plans be dark and impenetrable as night, and when you move, fall like a thunderbolt. Rule number 20. When you plunder a countryside, let the spoil be divided amongst your men. When you capture When you capture new territory, cut it up into allotments for the benefit of the soldiery. Rule number 21. Ponder and deliberate before you make a move. Rule number 22. He will conquer who has learnt the artifice of deviation. Such is the art of maneuvering. Rule number 23. The Book of Army Management says, on the field of battle, the spoken word does not carry far enough, hence the institution of gongs and drums. Nor can ordinary objects be seen clearly enough, hence the institution of banners and flags. Rule number 24. Gongs and drums, banners and flags are means whereby the ears and eyes of the host may be focused on one particular point. Rule number 25. The host thus forming a single united body is impossible either for the brave to advance alone or for the cowardly to retreat alone. This is the art of handling large masses of men. Rule number 26. In night fighting, then, make much use of signal fires and drums, and in fighting by day, of flags and banners, as a means of influencing the ears and eyes of your army. Rule number 27. A whole army may be robbed of its spirit. A commander-in-chief may be robbed of his presence of mind. Rule number 28. Now a soldier's spirit is keenest in the morning. By noonday it has begun to flag, and in the evening his mind is bent only on returning to camp. Rule 29. A clever general, therefore, avoids an army when its spirit is keen, but attacks it when it is sluggish and inclined to return. This is the art of studying moods. Rule 30. Discipline and calm, to await the appearance of disorder and hubbub amongst the enemy. This is the art of retaining self-possession. Rule number 31. To be near the goal while the enemy is still far from it, to wait at ease. While the enemy is toiling and struggling, to be well fed, while the enemy is famished. This is the art of husbanding one's strength. Rule number 32. To refrain from intercepting an enemy whose banners are in perfect order, to refrain from attacking an army drawn up in calm and confident array. This is the art of studying circumstances. Rule number 33. It is a military axiom not to advance uphill against the enemy, nor to oppose him when he comes downhill. Rule number 34. Do not pursue an enemy who simulates flight. Do not attack soldiers whose temper is keen. Rule number 35. Do not swallow a bait offered by the enemy. Do not interfere with an army that is returning home. Rule number 36. When you surround an army, leave an outlet free. Do not press a desperate foe too hard. Rule number 37. Such is the art of warfare. Chapter 8. Variation of Tactics. Rule number 1. Sun Tzu said, in war, the general receives his commands from the sovereign, collects his army, and concentrates his forces. Rule number 2. When in difficult country, do not encamp. In country where high roads intersect, join hands with your allies. Do not linger in dangerously isolated positions. In hemmed-in situations, you must resort to stratagem. In a desperate position, you must fight. Rule number 3. There are roads which must not be followed, armies which must not be attacked, towns which must not be besieged, positions which must not be contested, commands of the sovereign which must not be obeyed. Rule number 4. The general who thoroughly understands the advantages that accompany variation of tactics knows how to handle his troops. Rule number 5. The general who does not understand these may be well acquainted with the configuration of the contrary, yet he will not be able to turn his knowledge to practical account. Rule number 6. So the student of war who is unversed in the art of varying his plans, even though he be acquainted with the 5 advantages, will fail to make the best use of his men. Rule number 7. Hence, in the wise leader's plans, considerations of advantage and disadvantage will be blended together. Rule number 8. If our expectation of advantage be tempered in this way, we may succeed in accomplishing the essential part of our schemes. Rule number 9. If, on the other hand, in the midst of difficulties we are always ready to seize an advantage, we may extricate ourselves from misfortune. Rule number 10. Reduce the hostile chiefs by inflicting damage upon them, make trouble for them, and keep them constantly engaged. Hold out Hold out specious allurements, and make them rush to any given point. Rule number 11. The art of war teaches us to rely not on the likelihood of the enemy's not coming, but on our own readiness to receive him, not on the chance of his not attacking, but rather on the fact that we have made our own position unassailable. Rule number 12. There are 5 dangerous faults which may affect a general. Number 1. Recklessness, which leads to destruction. Rule number 2. Correction. Number 2. Cowardice, which leads to capture. 3. A hasty temper, which can be provoked by insults. 4. A delicacy of honor, which is sensitive to shame. 5. Over-solicitude for his men, which exposes him to worry and trouble. Rule number 13. These are the 5 besetting sins of a general, ruinous to the conduct of war. Rule number 14. When an enemy is overthrown and its leader slain, the cause will surely be found among these 5 dangerous faults. Let them be a subject of meditation. Chapter 9. The Army on the March. Rule number 1. Sun Tzu said, "We come now to the question of encamping the army and observing signs of the enemy. Pass quickly over mountains and keep in the neighborhood of valleys." Rule number 2. Camp in high places, not on high hills, but on knolls or hillocks elevated above the surrounding country, facing the sun. Do not climb heights in order to fight. So much for mountain warfare. Rule number 3. After crossing a river, you should get far away from it. Rule number 4. When an invading force crosses a river, in its onward march, do not advance to meet it midstream. It will be best to let half the army get across and then deliver your attack. Rule number 5. If you are anxious to fight, you should not go to meet the invader near a river which he has to cross. Rule number 6. Move your craft higher up than the enemy and face the sun. Do not move upstream to meet the enemy. So much for river warfare. Rule number 7. In crossing salt marshes, your sole concern should be to get over them quickly without any delay. Rule number 8. If forced to fight in a salt marsh, you should have water and grass near you, and get your back to a clump of trees. So much for operations in salt marshes. Rule number 9. In dry, level country, take up an easily accessible position, with rising ground to your right and on your rear, so that the dangers may be in front and safety lie behind. So much for campaigning in flat country. Rule number 10. These are the 4 useful branches of military knowledge, which enabled the Yellow Emperor to vanish for several These are the 4 useful branches of military knowledge, which enabled the Yellow Emperor to vanquish 4 several sovereigns. Rule number 11. All armies prefer high ground to low, and sunny places to dark. Rule number 12. If you are careful of your men and camp on hard ground, the army will be free from disease of every kind, and this will spell victory. Rule number 13. When you come to a hill or a bank, occupy the sunny side, with the slope on your right rear. Thus you will at once act for the benefit of your soldiers and utilize the natural advantages of the ground. Rule number 14. When, in consequence of heavy rains up country, a river which you wish to ford is swollen and flecked with foam, you must wait until it subsides. Rule number 15. Country in which there are precipitous cliffs with torrents running between, deep natural hollows, confined places, tangled thickets, quagmires, and crevasses, should be left with all possible speed and not approached. Rule number 16. While we keep away from such places, we should get the enemy to approach them. While we face them, we should let the enemy have them on his rear. Rule number 17. If in the neighborhood of your camp there should be any hilly country, ponds surrounded by aquatic grass, hollow basins filled with reeds, or woods with thick undergrowth, they must be carefully routed out and searched, for these are places where men in ambush or insidious spies are likely to be lurking. Rule number 18. When the enemy is close at hand and remains quiet, he is relying on the natural strength of his position. Rule number 19. When he keeps aloof and tries to provoke a battle, he is anxious for the other side to advance. Rule number 20. If his place of encampment is easy of access, he is tendering a bait. Rule number 21. Movement against the trees of a forest shows that the enemy is advancing. The appearance of a number of screens in the midst of thick grass means that the enemy wants to make us suspicious. Rule number 22. Rule number 22. The rising of birds in their flight is the sign of an ambuscade. Startled beasts indicate that a sudden attack is coming. Rule number 23. When there is dust rising in a high column, it is a sign of chariots advancing. When the dust is low but spread over a wide area, it betokens the approach of infantry. When it branches out in different directions, it shows that parties have been sent to collect firewood. A few clouds of dust moving to and fro signify that the army is encamping. Rule number 24. Humble words and increased preparations are signs that the enemy is about to advance. Looks like it jumped ahead on us a touch. Violent language and driving forward as if to the attack are signs that he will correction. Violent language and driving forward as if to the attack are signs that he will retreat. Rule 25. When the light chariots come out first and take up a position on the wings, it is a sign that the enemy is forming for battle. Rule 26. Peace proposals unaccompanied by a sworn covenant indicate a plot. Rule 27. When there is much running about, and the soldiers fall into rank, it means that the critical moment has come. Rule 28. When some are seen advancing and some retreating, it is a lure. Rule 29. When the soldiers stand leaning on their spears, they are faint from want of food. Rule 30. If those who are sent to draw water begin by drinking themselves, the army is suffering from thirst. Rule 31. If the enemy sees an advantage to be gained, and makes no effort to secure it, the soldiers are exhausted. Rule 32. If birds gather on any spot, it is unoccupied. Clamor by night betokens nervousness. Rule number 33. If there is disturbance in the camp, the general's authority is weak. If the banners and flags are shifted about, sedition is afoot. If the officers are angry, it means that the men are weary. Rule 34. When an army feeds its horses with grain and kills its cattle for food, and when the men do not hang their cooking pots over the campfires, showing that they will not return to their tents, you may know that they are determined to fight to the death. Rule 35. The sight of men whispering together in small knots or speaking in subdued tones points to disaffection among The sight of men whispering together in small knots or speaking in subdued tones points to disaffection amongst the rank and file. Rule 36. Too frequent rewards signify that the enemy is at the end of his resources. Too many punishments betray a condition of dire distress. Rule 37. To begin by bluster, but afterwards to take fright at the enemy's numbers, shows a supreme lack of intelligence. Rule 38. When envoys are sent with compliments in their mouths, it is a sign that the enemy wishes for a truce. Rule 39. If the enemy's troops march up angrily and remain facing ours for a long time, without either joining battle or taking themselves off again, the situation is one that demands great vigilance and circumspection. Rule 40. If our troops are no more in number than the enemy, that is amply sufficient. It only means that no direct attack can be made. What we can do is simply concentrate all our available strength, keep a close watch on the enemy, and obtain reinforcements. Rule 41. He who exercises no forethought but makes light of his opponents is sure to be captured by them. Rule 42. If soldiers are punished before they have grown attached to you, they will not prove submissive, and unless submissive, they will be practically useless. If, when soldiers have become attached to you, punishments are not enforced, they will still be useless. Rule 43. Therefore, soldiers must be treated in the first instance with humanity, but kept under control by means of iron discipline. This is a certain road to victory. Rule 44. If in training soldiers, commands are habitually enforced, the army is well disciplined. If not, its discipline will be bad. Rule 45. If a general shows confidence in his men, but always insists on his orders being obeyed, the gain will be mutual. Okay, and time for another break. Good time indeed. About halfway through. And going for almost 3 hours. Not terribly bad, I dare say. Albeit with the initial difficulty that was experienced. I am curious as to whether I will make the whole book in a single day. We shall see, most certainly. I do think that my voice is getting rather weary, on the other hand, so we may. I might take a particularly extended break and then come back, but I'm not certain about that yet. I think it perhaps best to strike while the irons are hot and the voice is warmed up, rather than to sort of roll it off and let it happen, that I come back to it later. But we'll see. We shall certainly see. Chapter 10. Terrain. Rule 1. Sun Tzu said, "We may distinguish 6 kinds of terrain, to wit, number 1, accessible ground, 2, entangling ground, 3, temporizing ground, 4, narrow passes, 5, precipitous heights, 6, positions at a great distance from the enemy." Rule 2. Ground which can be freely traversed by both sides is called accessible. Rule 3. With regard to ground of this nature, be before the enemy in occupying the raised and sunny spots, and carefully guard your line of supplies. Then you will be able to fight with advantage. Rule 4. Ground which can be abandoned but is hard to reoccupied is called entangling. Rule 5. From a position of this sort, if the enemy is unprepared, you may sally forth and defeat him, but if the enemy is prepared for your coming, and you fail to defeat him, then returning being impossible, disaster will ensue. Rule 6. When the position is such that neither side will gain by making the first move, it is called temporizing ground. Rule 7. In a position of this sort, even though the enemy should offer us an attractive bait, it will be advisable not to stir forth, but rather to retreat, thus enticing the enemy in his turn. Then, when part of his army has come out, we may deliver our attack with advantage. Rule 8. With regard to narrow passes, if you can occupy them first, let them be strongly garrisoned and await the advent of the enemy. Rule 9. Should the enemy forestall you in occupying a pass, do not go after him if the pass is fully garrisoned, but only if it is weakly garrisoned. Rule 10. With regard to precipitous heights, if you are beforehand with your adversary, you should occupy the raised and sunny spots, and there wait for him to come up. Rule 11. If the enemy has occupied them before you, do not follow him, but retreat and try to entice him away. Rule 12. If you are situated at a great distance from the enemy, and the strength of the two armies is equal, it is not easy to provoke a battle, and fighting will be to your advantage. Correction. If you are situated at a great distance from the enemy, and the strength of the two armies is equal, it is not easy to provoke a battle, and fighting will be to your disadvantage. Rule 13. These 6 are the principles connected with Earth. The general who has attained a responsible post must be careful to study them. Rule 14. Now an army is exposed to 6 several calamities, not arising from natural causes, but from faults for which the general is responsible. These are 1. Flight, 2. Insubordination, 3. Collapse, 4. Ruin, 5. Disorganization, 6. Rout. Rule 15. Other conditions being equal, if one force is hurled against another 10 times its size, the result will be the flight of the former. Rule 16. When the common soldiers are too strong and their officers too weak, the result is insubordination. When the officers are too strong and the common soldiers too weak, the result is collapse. Rule 17. When the higher officers are angry and insubordinate, and on meeting, the enemy give battle on their own account from a feeling of resentment, before the commander-in-chief can tell whether or no he is in a position to fight, the result is ruin. Rule 18. When the general is weak and without authority, when his orders are not clear and distinct, when there are no fixed duties assigned to officers and men, and the ranks are formed in a slovenly haphazard manner, the result is utter disorganization. Rule 19. When a general, unable to estimate the enemy's strength, allows an inferior force to engage a larger one, or hurls a weak detachment against a powerful one. Correction. When a general, unable to estimate the enemy's strength, allows an inferior force to engage a larger one, or hurls a weak detachment against a powerful one, and neglects to place picked soldiers in the front rank, the result must be a rout. Rule 20. These are 6 ways of courting defeat, which must be carefully noted by the general who has attained a responsible post. Rule 21. The natural formation of the country is the soldier's best ally, but a power of estimating the adversary, of controlling the forces of victory, and of shrewdly calculating difficulties, dangers, and distances constitutes the test of a great general. Rule 22. He who knows these things, and in fighting puts his knowledge into practice, will win his battles. He who knows them not, nor practices them, will surely be defeated. Rule 23. If fighting is sure to result in victory, then you must fight, even though the ruler forbid it. If fighting will not result in victory, then you must not fight, even at the ruler's bidding. Rule 24. The general who advances without coveting fame, and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country and do good service for his sovereign, is the jewel of the kingdom. Rule 25. Regard your soldiers as your children, and they will follow you into the deepest valleys. Look on them as you look upon... Correction. Look on them as your own beloved sons, and they will stand by you even unto death. 26. If, however, you are indulgent but unable to make your authority felt, kind-hearted but unable to enforce your commands, and incapable, moreover, of quelling disorder, then your soldiers must be likened to spoilt children. They are useless for any practical purpose. Rule 27. If we know that our own men are in a condition to attack, but are unaware that the enemy is not open to attack, we have gone only halfway towards victory. Rule 28. If we know that the enemy is open to attack, but are unaware that our own men are not in a condition to attack, we have gone only halfway towards victory. Correction. We have gone only halfway towards victory. Rule 29. If we know that the enemy is open to attack, and also know that our men are in a condition to attack, but are unaware that the nature of the ground makes fighting impracticable, we have still only... Correction. We have still gone only halfway towards victory. Rule 30. Hence, the experienced soldier, once in motion, is never bewildered. Once he has broken camp, he is never at a loss. Rule 31. Hence the saying, if you know the enemy, and you know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt. If you know heaven and know earth, you may make your victory complete. Chapter 11. The 9 Situations. Rule 1. Sun Tzu said, the art of war recognizes 9 varieties of ground. 1. Dispersive ground. 2. Facile ground. 3. Contentious ground. 4. Open ground. 5. Ground of intersecting highways. 6. Serious ground. 7. Difficult ground. 8. Hemmed-in ground. 9. Desperate ground. Rule 2. When a chieftain is fighting in his own territory, it is dispersive ground. Rule 3. When he has penetrated into hostile territory, but to no great distance, this is facile ground. Rule 4. Ground the possession of which imports great advantage. Correction. Ground the possession of which imports great advantage to either side. Second correction. Ground the possession of which imports great advantage to either side is contentious ground. 5. Ground on which either side has liberty of movement is open ground. Correction. Rule 5. Ground on which either side has liberty of movement is open ground. Rule 6. Correction. Rule 6. Ground which forms the key to 3 contiguous states, so that he who occupies it first has most of the empire at his command, is ground of intersecting highways. Rule 7. When an army has penetrated into the heart of a hostile country, leaving a number of fortified cities in its rear, it is serious ground. Rule 8. Mountain forests, rugged steppes, mountain forests, rugged steeps, marshes and fens, all country that is hard to traverse. This is difficult ground. Rule 9. Ground which is reached through ground which is reached through narrow gorges, and from which we can only retire by tortuous paths, so that a small number of the enemy would suffice to crush a large so that a small number of the enemy would suffice to crush a large body of our men. This is hemmed-in ground. Rule 10. Ground on which we can only be saved from destruction by fighting without delay is desperate ground. Rule 11. On dispersive ground, therefore, fight not. On dispersive ground, therefore, fight not. On facile ground, halt not. On contiguous ground, attack not. Rule 12. On open ground, do not try to block the enemy's way. On ground of intersecting highways, join hands with your allies. Rule 13. On serious ground, gather in plunder. In difficult ground, keep steadily on the march. Rule 14. On hemmed-in ground, resort to stratagem. On desperate ground, fight. Rule 15. Those who were called skillful leaders of old knew how to drive a wedge between the enemy's front and rear, to prevent cooperation between his large and small divisions. To prevent cooperation between his large and small divisions, to hinder the good troops from rescuing the bad, the officers from rallying their men. Rule 16. When the enemy's men were scattered, they prevented them from concentrating. Even when their forces were united, they managed to keep them in disorder. Rule 17. Rule 17. When it was to their advantage, they made a forward move. When otherwise, they stopped still. Rule 18. If asked how to cope with a great host of the enemy, in orderly array and on the point of marching to the attack, I should say, begin by seizing something which your opponents hold dear. Then he will be amenable to your will. Rule 19. Rapidity is the essence of war. Take advantage of the enemy's unreadiness, make your way by unexpected routes, and attack unguarded spots. Rule 20. The following are the principles to be observed by an invading force. The further you penetrate into a country, the greater will be the solidarity of your troops, and thus the defenders will not prevail against you. Rule 21. Make forays in fertile country in order to supply your army with food. Rule 22. Carefully study the well-being of your men and do not overtax them. Concentrate your energy and hoard your strength. Keep your army continually on the move and devise unfathomable plans. Rule 23. Throw your soldiers into positions whence there is no escape, and they will prefer death to flight. If they will face death, there is nothing they may not achieve. Officers and men alike will put forth their uttermost strength. Rule 24. Soldiers, when in desperate straits, lose the sense of fear. If there is no place of refuge, they will stand firm. If they are in the heart of a hostile country... If they are in the heart of a We are coming near the end of the stream. If they are in the heart of a hostile country, they will show a stubborn front. If there is no help for it, they will fight hard. Rule 25. Thus, without waiting to be marshaled, the soldiers will constantly be on the qui-vive. Without waiting to be asked, they will do your will. Without restrictions, they will be faithful. Without giving orders, they can be trusted. Rule 26. Prohibit the taking of omens, and do away with superstitious doubts. Then, until death itself comes, no calamity need be feared. Rule 27. If our soldiers are not overburdened with money, it is not because they have a distaste for riches. If their lives are not unduly long, it is not because they are disinclined to longevity. Rule 28. On the day they are ordered out to battle, your soldiers may weep. Those sitting up bedewing their garden, Those sitting up bedewing their garments, and those lying down letting the tears run down their Those sitting up bedewing their garments, and those lying down letting the tears run down their cheeks. But let them once be brought to bay, and they will display the courage of a Chu or a Kuei. Rule 29. The skillful tactician may be likened to the Shuai Jan. Now, the Shuai Jan is a snake that is found in the Chang Mountains. Strike at its head, and you will be attacked by its tail. Strike at its tail, and you will be attacked by its head. Strike at its middle, and you will be attacked by head and tail both. Rule 30. Asked if an army can be made to imitate the Shuaijan, I should answer, yes. For the men of Wu and the men of Yue are enemies. Yet, if they are crossing a river in the same boat and are caught by a storm, they will come to each other's assistance, just as the left hand helps the right. Rule 31. Hence it is not enough to put one's trust in the tethering of horses and the burying of chariot wheels in the ground. Rule 32. The principle on which to manage an army is to set up one standard of courage which all must reach. Rule 33. How to make the best of both strong and weak. That is a question involving the proper use of ground. Rule 34. Thus the skillful general conducts his army just as though he were leading a single man, willy-nilly by the hand. Rule 35. It is the business of a general to be quiet and thus ensure secrecy, upright and just, and thus maintain order. Rule 36. He must be able to mystify his officers and men by false reports and appearances, and thus keep them in total ignorance. Rule 37. By altering his arrangements and changing his plans, he keeps the enemy without definite knowledge. By shifting his camp and taking circuitous routes, he prevents the enemy from anticipating his purpose. Rule 38. At the critical moment, the leader of an army acts like one who has climbed up a height and then kicks away the ladder behind him. He carries his men deep into hostile territory before he shows his hand. Rule 39. He burns his boats and breaks his cooking pots. Like a shepherd driving a flock of sheep, he drives his men this way and that, and none knows whither he is going. Rule 40. To muster his host and bring it into danger, this may be termed the business of the general. Rule 41. The different measures suited to the 9 varieties of ground, the expediency of aggressive or defensive tactics, and the fundamental laws of human nature, these are things that must most certainly be studied. Rule 42. When invading hostile territory, the general principle is that penetrating deeply brings cohesion. Penetrating but a short way means dispersion. Rule 43. When you leave your own country behind and take your army across neighboring territory, you find yourself on critical ground. When there are means of communication on all 4 sides, the ground is one of intersecting highways. Rule 44. When you penetrate deeply into a country, it is serious ground. When you penetrate but a little way, it is facile ground. Rule 45. When you have the enemy's strongholds on your rear, and narrow passes in the front, it is hemmed-in ground. When there is no place of refuge at all, it is desperate ground. Rule 46. Therefore, on dispersive ground, I would inspire my men with unity of purpose. On facile ground, I would see that there is no... On facile ground, I would see that there is close connection between all parts of my army. Rule 47. On contentious ground, I would hurry up my rear. Rule 48. On open ground, I would keep a vigilant eye on my defenses. On ground of intersecting highways, I would consolidate my alliances. Rule 49. On serious ground, I would try to ensure a continuous stream of supplies. On difficult ground, I would keep pushing on along the road. Rule 50. On hemmed-in ground, I would block any way of retreat. On desperate ground, I would proclaim to my soldiers the hopelessness of saving their lives. Rule 51. For it is the soldier's disposition to offer an obstinate resistance when surrounded, to fight hard when he cannot help himself, and to obey promptly when he has fallen into danger. Rule 52. We cannot enter into alliance with neighboring princes until we are acquainted with their designs. We are not fit to lead an army on the march unless we are familiar with the land. We are not fit to lead an army on the march unless we are familiar with the face of the country, its mountains and forests, its pitfalls and precipices, its marshes and swamps. We shall be unable to turn natural advantages to account unless we make use of local guides. Rule 53. To be ignorant of any one of the following 4 or 5 principles does not befit a warlike prince. Rule 54. When a warlike prince attacks a powerful state, his generalship shows itself in preventing the concentration of the enemy's forces. He overawes his opponents, and their allies are prevented from joining against him. Rule 55. Hence, he does not strive to ally himself with all and sundry, nor does he foster the power of other states. He carries out his own secret designs, keeping his antagonists in awe. Thus, he is able to capture the cities and overthrow their kingdoms. Rule 56. Bestow rewards without regard to rule, issue orders without regard to previous arrangements, and you will be able to handle a whole army, as though you had to do with but a single man. And you will be able to handle a whole army, as though you had to do with but a single man. Yes, it is coming near, indeed, to the end of the podcast. One moment. Apologies, had to blow my nose quickly. And back to it. Rule 56. Bestow rewards without regard to rule. Issue orders without regard to previous arrangements, and you will be able to handle a whole army, as though you had to do with but a single man. Rule 57. Confront your soldiers with the deed itself. Never let them know your design. When the outlook is bright, bring it before their eyes, but tell them nothing when the situation is gloomy. Rule 58. Place your army in deadly peril, and it will survive. Plunge it into desperate straits, and it will come off in safety. Rule 59. For it is precisely when a force has fallen into harm's way that it is capable of striking a blow for victory. Rule 60. Success in warfare is gained by carefully accommodating ourselves to the enemy's purpose. Rule 61. By persistently hanging on the enemy's flank, we shall succeed in the long run in killing the commander-in-chief. Rule 62. This is called ability to accomplish a thing by sheer cunning. Rule 63. On the day that you take up your command, block the frontier passes, destroy the official tallies, and stop the passage of all emissaries. Rule 64. Be stern in the council chamber so that you may control the situation. Rule 65. If the enemy leaves a door... Correction. If the enemy leaves a door open, you must rush in. Rule 66. Forestall your opponent by seizing what he holds dear, and subtly contrive to time his arrival on the ground. Rule 67. Walk in the path defined by rule, and accommodate yourself to the enemy until you can fight a decisive battle. Rule 68. At first, then, exhibit the coyness of a maiden, until the enemy gives you an opening. Afterwards, emulate the rapidity of a running hare, and it will be too late for the enemy to oppose you. Okay, so we only have 2 chapters left, but I admit, this has run a good while, and my voice is in need of a rest, I dare say. So, in regard of that, I think it best to preserve this as a bit of a forerunner to a following stream regarding drives and the various things that inspire me across time. And after that, we shall perhaps do something quite not so vocal. We'll do a little bit of maybe, gaming. Yes, there are a few games of childhood that I think would be, welcome, and a few, of course, that come into later adulthood that definitely offered to, give me a bit of a look into, as in the introduction, the whole art of storytelling. And so, with that being said, to whomever may watch this in the coming days, you can anticipate that there will be a follow-up to this video, naturally, but also a coming, I would say probably once a week, as far as I can manage it, of streams, and I'll update people on my Twitter or X as they prefer it. And of course, for those of you who might be in the Discord or interested in joining the Discord now that you've heard about it, updates will naturally be posted there as well. All of this, as it were, I hope that if you did enjoy my content, you do all of the things that everybody else would ask, and I too, by extension, must. Please give us a like. Please give us a good review on the Spotify upload if you do happen to cross by it. And otherwise, if you do find it worthy of it, consider Patreon. Or, of course, if you want something less subscriptive, there's always Streamelements through which you can tip me. Whatever you should get up to in the future, I hope that today's presentation, which will of course be cut into a proper audiobook with highlights to come, was enlightening, if not at least entertaining, to those of you who enjoy learning a little bit about the ways and works of command, naturally, in the context of a state and army, but also for those of you cunning enough to actually apply this to yourself and your own ventures elsewise. That'll be all then. This is Kairos, signing off.